September 9, 1087. A room in Rouen. A man dying on a bed. The servants left hours ago. They did not say goodbye. They took the silver on the table, the good wool blankets, the small things that had value and could be carried quickly. In the world they lived in, a dying king was the most dangerous thing you could be standing next to when the power finally shifted. So they read the room, made their calculation, and walked out the door. The man on the bed had conquered England. He had crossed the Channel with an army, killed a king on a hill in Sussex, and placed a crown on his own head in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. He had built castles on every high ground in England. He had replaced the entire English aristocracy with his own people. He had commissioned a survey so total and so final that the English called it the Domesday Book, because just like the Last Judgment, there was no appealing it. He had done all of that, and he died alone while Paris celebrated in the streets. The funeral, when it came, was worse. His body had swollen in the September heat. The stone sarcophagus at the abbey did not fit. The men trying to force him in pushed too hard. The smell drove the mourners out before the prayers were finished. That was the end of William the Conqueror. Here is what makes it worth thinking about. He was not a man who failed. He was one of the most consequential rulers in the history of the Western world. The language you are hearing right now carries his fingerprints. The words beef, castle, justice, noble, court, government, all of them entered English from the Norman French. His invasion brought across the Channel. The Tower of London is still standing. The Domesday Book is still in the archive, still legible, still used as a legal reference. He won, permanently, historically, completely, and he died on a floor in Rouen while the people he had paid to care for him divided up his possessions before his body was cold. The question this story is really about is not how William conquered England. That part is known. The question is what it cost him to need it so badly, to chase a crown across the sea and spend 30 years holding it down by force, and whether anything he built was ever enough to fill the thing inside him that started building in the first place. That thing started in a town called Falaise, around the year 1028, with a girl, a duke, and a child who was never supposed to matter. There is a hill above the town of Falaise in Normandy, where a castle has stood for nearly 1,000 years. You can visit it today. The stone keep was rebuilt in later periods, but the hill is the same hill. The view over the Norman countryside is the same view, and according to the oldest versions of the story, it was from somewhere in this complex that Robert, Duke of Normandy, first saw a young woman named Herleva walking in the town below. She was not noble. Her father was either a tanner or an undertaker, depending on which source you read. That disagreement tells you something about how carefully the people writing these sources thought she mattered. She was, by every measure, the 11th century had for such things. Nobody. Robert took her as his mistress. She became pregnant, and sometime around 1028, she gave birth to a boy. The boy was named William. In the Latin that the church and the courts and every serious institution of his world used for every serious purpose, he was Wilhelmus Bastardus, William the Bastard. That was not a nickname. It was a legal description. It meant his father's blood ran in him, but the law did not fully recognize it. It meant he could inherit, but only if his father chose it, and only if the Norman barons accepted it. And even then, it would always be something that could be questioned, always a door that other men could try to close. Robert I was not a cruel father by the standards of his time. He acknowledged William openly. He kept Helena at court, then arranged a respectable marriage for her to a Norman nobleman, which actually elevated her position. He treated his illegitimate son with enough public recognition that the Norman nobility understood exactly what he intended. What he intended was for William to inherit Normandy. This was not as impossible as it sounds. Normandy, in the early 11th century, had been built by men who understood that power was taken, not given. The Normans were, at their root, Vikings, Northmen. Their first duke, Rojo, had carved this territory out of northern France through violence and negotiation roughly 100 years before William was born. The culture they built had a Norse directness about power underneath its Frankish feudal surface. You held what you could hold. You kept what you could defend, but even by Norman standards, making a bastard the heir to a duchy required follow-through. Robert followed through. Before he left on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1034 or 1035, he called the Norman barons together and made them swear loyalty to William as his successor. They swore, because Robert was standing in front of them. Then Robert left, and the barons started calculating. Robert died on the road back from Jerusalem, at Nicaea. In 1035, he had made it to the Holy City and come most of the way home. And then he did not. William was 7 years old, or 8. The sources do not agree on this either. He was now Duke of Normandy. Think about what that meant in practice. A child, already questioned for his birth, suddenly holding nominal authority over a collection of powerful, armed, ambitious men who had sworn an oath to a duke who was now dead, an oath to a 7-year-old orphan in a world where power required physical presence and personal force, was an oath with a limited shelf life. And everyone in Normandy understood this simultaneously. The barons looked at the child duke. They started moving. 3 of William's guardians were murdered in the years that followed. Not from illness, not from accident. They were killed by men who wanted to control the young duke or remove him entirely. William learned to sleep in different places on different nights, not because he was restless, because staying in one place would make it easier to find him. He was a child. That was his life. Orderic Vitalis, the historian who would one day write the most honest account of the Norman period, described the Norman nobility of these years with barely concealed contempt. Orderic had particular reason to understand both sides of what Normandy produced. He was the son of a Norman knight and an English woman, born in 1075, raised inside the world the conquest created. He understood what the Norman aristocracy was capable of at its best and its worst, because he had spent his life writing about both. What he described in Normandy during William's childhood was not a duchy. It was a competition, run by men who had decided that the bastard boy was an obstacle rather than an authority. One of the more persistent stories from these years, repeated in enough different sources to take seriously, even if the details shift between tellings, describes a night when one of William's household servants smuggled him out of a castle and hid him in a farmhouse because the castle itself was no longer safe. The servant did not do this on order. He did it because he looked at the situation and made a decision that the boy's life was in danger and that getting him out quietly was the only available response. William slept in a farmhouse that night. He was 9 or 10 years old. He would not fully stop operating as if the farmhouse might not be safe either for the rest of his life. This is the thing that neither of the 2 standard versions of William gets right. The celebratory version focuses on his military genius. his administrative vision, his transformation of England. The critical version focuses on the harrying of the north, the brutality, the systematic dispossession of the English. Both versions are talking about the same man. Neither one starts where the story actually starts. It starts here, in the dark in a farmhouse in Normandy, with a child who had learned before he was old enough to reason about it that the world was not arranged for his safety, that the things he was supposed to be able to count on could be taken without warning, and that the only reliable response was to never fully put down your guard. The Normans who were killing his guardians and manoeuvring for control of his duchy were teaching him something they did not intend to teach him. They were teaching him what power actually required. In 1037, or 1038, a delegation from Normandy travelled to the French royal court and asked King Henry I to serve as William's protector. This was the kind of political insurance that a threatened minor lord seeks from the most powerful available patron. Henry agreed. It gave William some external cover, some reason for the more calculating barons to think twice before moving directly against him. It did not make him safe, but it made him harder to remove without visible cost. He was 10 years old and already building alliances designed to make his removal politically expensive for anyone considering it. What that kind of childhood builds is not bitterness, necessarily. It is something more functional and more dangerous. It is a precise and permanent understanding of how power actually works. It is the knowledge that trust is a liability unless it is backed by something structural. It is the habit, learned so early, it becomes instinct, of reading every room for where the threat is coming from, before you decide how to act. William the Bastard was going to spend the next 50 years constructing legitimacy. He was going to construct it from marriages and military campaigns, from papal blessings and broken oaths, from stone buildings and a book that recorded every field in England. He was going to build and build and build, with the specific urgency of a man who understood from childhood that what you did not actively hold could be taken. And underneath all of it, in the foundation, was the farmhouse, the night the servant made the call, the child who learned that staying in one place made it easier to find you. He carried that knowledge to Rouen. He carried it to the floor where he died. Some things you learn before you have words for them stay with you longer than anything you learn after. Bales Dunes, 1047. That is where the story turns. But before the battle, you need to understand what Normandy had become in the 12 years between Robert I dying on the road home from Jerusalem and his 19-year-old bastard son riding onto a field to fight for his own duchy. The Norman barons had used William's minority, the way men with power and no immediate consequence always use a vacuum. They expanded, they settled scores, they built alliances and broke them and built new ones. They treated the ducal authority as something to be managed rather than obeyed, something to root around, something that existed on paper while the real business of Normandy happened in private agreements between men with swords and land. The specific danger was not one man or one faction. It was a system in which the most powerful thing you could do with a weak duke was keep him weak, because a weak duke could not tax you properly, could not enforce obligations you preferred to ignore, could not stop you from doing to your neighbours what you were afraid your neighbours were doing to you. William grew up inside that system. He watched it from the inside. He understood it better than any of the men running it understood it, because they saw it as an opportunity and he saw it as a threat. And people who feel threatened pay closer attention than people who feel comfortable. By his late teens, he was not just surviving Normandy. He was reading it. The man who changed what came next was not a Norman baron. He was an Italian. Lanfranc was born in Pavia in northern Italy, trained as a lawyer, and had somehow ended up at a small monastery called Le Bec in Normandy after abandoning a legal career with the restless dissatisfaction of someone who had not yet found the right container for his abilities. He turned Le Bec into one of the most intellectually serious religious houses in Northern Europe, attracting students from across the continent who wanted rigorous theology and Latin education and arguments that did not collapse under scrutiny. William found him and recognized immediately what he had. Not a churchman, a conversation partner who was not afraid of him. Every other man in William's orbit served him. They advised him with the careful calibration of people whose safety depended on reading his moods correctly. They told him what he wanted to hear, with the practiced ease of men who had survived by doing exactly that for years. Even the men who were loyal to him, genuinely loyal, understood that their loyalty required them to manage how they said difficult things. Lanfranc did not manage. He told William when he thought William was wrong, with the directness of a man who had enough independent standing and enough genuine indifference to ducal favour that the consequences of honesty were ones he was willing to accept. William kept him close for decades. He eventually made him Archbishop of Canterbury after the conquest of England. That is not the decision of a man who only wants to be agreed with. It is the decision of a man who understood, from growing up in a world where everyone around him had an angle, how rare it was to find someone who would tell you the truth. Now, Falaise, a man named Guy of Burgundy, had a claim to Normandy, distant and arguable, the kind of claim that men with ambition and armies find more convincing the longer they look at it. He raised a rebellion. Other Norman barons joined him, enough of them that this was a genuine military confrontation and not a policing problem. William did two things. First, he asked for help. He rode to King Henry I of France, his nominal overlord, and made the case that a stable Normandy under a capable duke served France better than a fractured Normandy run by competing barons who would eventually become a problem for everyone. The argument was practical, and it was correct, and Henry agreed to it. Second, once he had the French forces alongside him, he fought the battle at Falaise in the spring of 1047. Was not a long engagement. Guy of Burgundy's coalition broke. Guy fled. The men who had spent years treating Normandy as their personal territory were killed or captured or forced to submit on terms William set. He had won his duchy, or, more precisely, he had won the right to keep fighting for his duchy, which was not the same thing, but was the only outcome available. What followed Falaise was not peace. It was a decade of smaller conflicts, zegas, negotiations, and the slow, grinding work of demonstrating to every baron in Normandy that the bastard duke was not going anywhere. He besieged Brionne Castle for 3 years to force the submission of one man. 3 years of maintaining a siege in medieval conditions, which meant cold and disease and desertion and the constant pressure of keeping an army in the field, past the point where rational men would have negotiated a settlement. He did not negotiate. He waited, because he understood something that Falaise had confirmed for him. The men who had made his childhood dangerous had done so because they believed he could be removed. The only way to change that belief permanently was to demonstrate, again and again, that the cost of trying was higher than any conceivable benefit. This is not a complicated insight about power. It is one of the oldest observations that exists. But there is a genuine difference between understanding something intellectually and being willing to live it out through years of cold sieges, constant vigilance, and the specific exhaustion of never being fully at ease in your own territory. William was willing. He had been practicing for this since he was 7. There are descriptions of him in these years that come through the sources with enough consistency to feel reliable. He was physically large, tall for the era, broad through the shoulders, with a voice that carried in a room without effort. He was not elegant in the courtly sense that some rulers cultivated. He was direct, and he was capable of a cold fury that was more frightening than hot anger, because it did not dissipate quickly. Men who had made him angry in the morning reported that the anger was still precisely where they had left it by evening. He was also, and this matters, genuinely intelligent in a practical way, not a scholar, possibly not fully literate in the formal sense, though he conducted business in Latin and understood it, but he read situations with the precision of someone who had spent his entire life needing to know where the danger was coming from before it arrived. Then there was Matilda. Matilda of Flanders was the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders. Flanders, in the 1050s, was one of the most politically significant territories in northern Europe. A marriage alliance with Flanders would give William a powerful neighbour as an ally rather than a potential threat, and it would give his dynasty a bloodline that nobody could question. The story of how he got it is one of the most disputed episodes in a life full of disputed episodes. The version that survives most vividly says that William asked for Matilda's hand and was refused. That Matilda said she would rather take the veil than marry a bastard. That William found her in Bruges and pulled her from her horse and beat her in the road. That Matilda then announced she would marry no one else. Medieval sources. Take what they offer and ask what the reality underneath might have been. What we know for certain is that the marriage happened around 1051, that it required a papal dispensation because they were related within prohibited degrees, and that the Pope initially refused, forcing William to proceed without approval, which put him briefly at odds with Rome. We know that Lanfranc helped navigate the eventual reconciliation with the papacy. We know the marriage lasted until Matilda died in 1083, and that, by all available evidence, it was the most stable relationship of William's life. We also know, because the record of her actions makes it impossible to miss, that Matilda was not a passive figure in anything she did. She was educated. She was politically engaged. When William was away, which was often, she governed Normandy with genuine executive authority. She made decisions that held. She corresponded with foreign courts. She managed the administration of a complex territory across years of her husband's absence, with the competence of someone who had been doing it long enough that it had become her work rather than a temporary substitution. There is something in the record about their relationship that historians keep noting because it does not fit the expected pattern of 11th century powerful men. William was faithful to her. In an era when mistresses were practically a demonstration of aristocratic status, when the production of illegitimate children was something powerful, men did openly and without apparent concern. William appears to have slept only with Matilda. Some historians attribute this to genuine affection, some to the cold calculation that his own illegitimate birth had cost him so much that producing more bastards was something he had every reason to avoid. It was probably both. And the fact that you cannot cleanly separate those two motivations is itself telling. A man shaped by what his illegitimacy had cost him chose to build a legitimate family with one woman. Whether that was love, or strategy, or the particular way that early wounds turn into the specific choices of an adult life. He made it. He held it. He kept it until she was gone. By the early 1060s, William had built something that had not existed in Normandy during his childhood. He had built a state, not just territory held by personal force, but a functioning administrative system, courts that operated according to consistent rules, a church reformed and organized with the help of Lanfranc, providing not just spiritual services but the literate administrative personnel that any serious governing enterprise required, financial arrangements that were tracked rather than improvised, a military organized around specific obligations, recorded and enforceable, that could put a professional force in the field on predictable terms. He had turned Normandy from an armed camp with a duke at the center into something that would keep running when he was not in the room. He understood why this mattered from direct personal experience. His father had run Normandy on personal loyalty and personal presence, and when his father died on a road in Turkey, everything that depended on that presence had immediately begun to fall apart. William was not going to build that again. He was going to build institutions. He was going to build obligations that existed on paper, in records, enforced by systems rather than by any single man's continued existence. This is what separated him from most rulers of his era, and it is what made him dangerous in a way that pure military power alone never could. Because as William was building Normandy into a machine, he was also looking north, across 30 miles of channel water. An aging, childless king named Edward the Confessor was running out of time, and William, the bastard duke who had spent his life constructing legitimacy from whatever materials were available, was watching with the focused attention of a man who had been practicing for a moment that had not yet arrived. He had a claim to the English throne, thin by blood, supported, he said, by Edward's personal promise, unrecognized by most of England, and contested by at least one man who was far better positioned to act on it. He had a duchy organized well enough to sustain a military campaign across open water. He had Matilda to hold Normandy while he was gone. He had Lanfranc to manage the church relationships that would determine whether Rome blessed the enterprise or condemned it, and he had the patience of a man who had learned to wait through 3-year sieges. All he needed was an event that would force the question. That event was coming. It was going to arrive in the form of a man named Harold Godwinson. A shipwreck, or a diplomatic mission, or something in between, and a ceremony involving holy relics in a hall in Normandy. It was going to give William the one thing he still needed: a story. Normandy in the 1050s was not a place most people would have chosen to live if they had options. It was a coastal territory in northern France, roughly the size of West Virginia, with good farmland, access to the sea, and a political culture shaped by 100 years of men who solved disagreements with weapons. The towns were small, the roads were poor, the winters were the specific cold of northern Europe that gets into stone and stays there. The social hierarchy was rigid and organized around a single question: who could take what, from whom, and hold it against challenge. Into this world, William introduced something the Norman barons had not encountered in quite this form before: order. Not the simple order of a strong man holding territory through personal presence and the threat of force, though that remained part of it. Something more structural: courts that functioned according to consistent rules rather than the mood of whoever was most powerful that day. Church councils that met regularly and produced decisions that held. Financial records kept in ways that made obligations trackable and enforceable. The slow, unglamorous machinery of a territory beginning to function like a state rather than like an armed camp with a duke at the center. This transformation did not happen overnight. It happened across 15 years of grinding, patient work, and it happened because William had understood something from his childhood that most rulers of his era had not been forced to learn. Personal power is fragile. Institutional power is not. A duke whose authority rests entirely on his physical presence can be outmaneuvered by distance, illness, or the shifting loyalties of men around him. William had seen what that fragility looked like from the inside. He had watched 3 of his guardians be murdered because the only thing protecting them was their connection to a child with no structural power. He was not going to build that again. What he was going to build was something that kept working when he was not in the room. Lanfranc was the center of this, not because Lanfranc was a gifted administrator, though he was, not because he gave William access to church networks and intellectual credibility, though he did, but because Lanfranc offered William something that almost no one else in his orbit could, a conversation partner who was not afraid of him. Every other man in William's court served him. They calibrated their words to his moods. They delivered difficult news with the practiced care of men whose safety depended on reading him correctly. Even the most loyal among them understood that loyalty required managing how you said hard things. Lanfranc did not manage. He said what he thought. He told William when William was wrong. He did this not out of recklessness, but out of the specific confidence of a man who had built enough of his own standing that the consequences of honesty were ones he was willing to accept. William kept him close for decades. He eventually made him Archbishop of Canterbury after the conquest of England. Think about what that tells you about William. In a world where powerful men surrounded themselves with people who confirmed their judgment, William made his most important ecclesiastical appointment the man who had spent years telling him he was wrong when he was wrong. That is not the choice of a man who only wants to be agreed with. Lanfranc helped William reform the Norman Church in the 1050s, and this mattered in ways that went beyond the religious. The Norman Church in this period was one of the primary administrative structures of the duchy. The bishops and abbots controlled land, recorded transactions, educated the clerks who kept records, and provided the institutional memory that a state needs to function across generations. Reforming the church meant making it more disciplined, more organized, more aligned with the central authority of the duke. William held church councils. He appointed men he trusted to key positions. He built abbeys, partly from genuine piety, and partly because an abbey was a center of literacy and trained personnel that served practical functions well beyond the spiritual. He also rebuilt the military. The Norman knights of this period were among the most formidable cavalry in Europe. The Normans had spent a century adapting Viking aggression to the mounted warfare of continental France, producing a warrior culture organized around the heavy cavalry charge in a way that other military traditions were not. William had inherited this culture. What he added was organization. He required his vassals to provide specific numbers of mounted knights for specific periods of service, recording these obligations in ways that made them enforceable and predictable. He paid attention to logistics in ways that most commanders of his era treated as details beneath their concern. He understood that an army that could not feed and supply itself over extended operations was not actually an army. It was a temporary gathering of men that would scatter when the food ran out. By the early 1060s, Normandy could put a professional military force in the field on relatively short notice, sustained by an administrative structure capable of keeping it there. This was, by the standards of the time and place, remarkable. Matilda was at the center of it in ways the historical record documents but does not fully capture. She appears in charters, in diplomatic correspondence, in the records of the abbeys she patronized. She and William founded the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen and the Abbey of the Holy Trinity together, a pair of institutions that served both religious and political purposes. The founding fulfilled a condition Rome had attached to approving their marriage, but it was also a statement, a physical expression of what William was trying to make permanent. Caen as the center of Norman ducal power, stone as the medium of that permanence. Matilda treated the women's house as her own project within the larger project. She ran Normandy when William was campaigning. The sources show her hearing legal disputes between Norman lords in William's absence. Her rulings holding not because she had an army, but because everyone in the room understood who she was standing in for, and what the consequences of ignoring her would be when that person returned. This is not a medieval cliché of the loyal wife minding the household. This is a political actor, managing a sophisticated territory with genuine competence while her husband was gone for months at a time. William knew this and relied on it. He organized his plans for England. When those plans became serious, around the assumption that Matilda could hold Normandy in his absence, he was right. The children came during these years. Several survived to adulthood. The oldest son was Robert, who the sources call Cur-those, short legs, a nickname his father apparently used with the specific ease of a man who did not worry about what his son thought of it. Robert was his designated heir for Normandy. Robert would become the organizing frustration of the last decade of William's life. But that is later. What matters here is what William and Matilda built in these years, and what it represented. Not a warm, domestic arrangement. Not comfort, but a working political enterprise organized around the goal of making something durable in a world that had shown both of them in different ways. That nothing was durable unless you made it so deliberately and kept making it so continuously. Now, England. Edward the Confessor was a king whose deepest interests lay somewhere other than the daily exercise of power. He was genuinely pious in a way that some medieval kings performed, and Edward actually lived. He built Westminster Abbey. He kept the peace. He maintained the kingdom through years of managing the immense power of the great earls without any of the tools that modern states have for managing such things. But he had no children. His marriage to Edith, the daughter of Earl Godwin, had produced no heirs. Whether this was the result of a vow of chastity that some sources attribute to Edward, or simply the biology of two people who were not well matched for each other, the result was the same. England needed a successor. Edward was unable or unwilling to settle the question cleanly. The House of Godwin was the dominant political force in England in a way that had no real Norman equivalent. Earl Godwin himself had been the most powerful man in England outside the king for decades before his death in 1053. His sons had inherited and extended that power. Harold, the second son, was Earl of Wessex, the richest and most strategically important earldom in the kingdom. His brother Tostig held Northumbria. His sister Edith was the queen. They were not a royal family, but they were the family England ran on. Harold Godwinson, by the early 1060s, was the most capable political and military leader England had produced in a generation. He had fought successful campaigns in Wales. He managed the relationships between the great earldoms with a skill that kept the kingdom from fracturing. The English thegns, the landowning class that formed the backbone of Anglo-Saxon governance, trusted him in the specific way you trust someone you have watched perform under pressure repeatedly and found steady every time, whether Harold wanted the throne for himself, whether he believed England's need gave him a legitimate claim. or whether he was carried to it by circumstances he did not fully control, is something the sources cannot cleanly resolve. What can be said is that Harold was not an opportunist in the simple sense. He was the man England had been organized around for years. When the question of what came after Edward became urgent, Harold was the answer that most of England had already been living with. William was watching all of this from Normandy. He had his claim, built from a distant family connection and a supposed promise from Edward that the English sources did not record, and only the Norman sources affirmed. He had his administration. He had his military. He had Lanfranc and Matilda, and 15 years of building a duchy into something that could sustain a campaign across open water. What he did not yet have was the event that would force the question. That event was about to arrive in his own hall, wearing English clothes, speaking with an English accent, and carrying, without fully understanding it yet, exactly the story William needed. The year was 1064. Harold Godwinson was coming to Normandy, and what happened in William's court at Rouen over the weeks that followed would be used to justify a war. Blessed by the Pope, carried across the Channel on a painted ship, and carved into stone and stitched into linen, and told and retold across 900 years. Whether it was true is the question the sources will never fully answer. Whether William cared about that distinction is the question the sources answer clearly. He did not. Start with what we know for certain. On January 5th, 1066, Edward the Confessor died at Westminster. He had been too ill to attend the consecration of his own abbey 8 days earlier, which tells you how far gone he was in those final weeks. The building he had spent years and enormous resources constructing, the project that was probably the central ambition of his reign, opened without him present to see it. The Witan met the following morning. They chose Harold Godwinson. He was crowned the same day. January 6th, in Westminster Abbey, by Aldred, Archbishop of York. In the ceremony that Anglo-Saxon tradition required, Harold was king. Now step back to the question that made that coronation so complicated, because the complication was real, and the sources that describe it are not lying. They are simply not all telling the same story. What had Edward actually promised? And to whom? And when? The Norman sources are consistent. Around 1051, Edward sent an embassy to Normandy promising William the succession. This is recorded in Norman chronicles. It is depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. It forms the legal thing about everything William was about to do. The English sources say nothing about it. Not a denial. Not a refutation. Nothing. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which recorded English events with reasonable consistency across this entire period, does not mention Edward making any such promise to William. Ever. In any form, this silence can be read as confirmation that the Norman account is accurate, and the English chose not to record a promise they found inconvenient. It can be read as evidence that the promise never happened, or happened in a much more limited form than the Normans described. It can be read as the natural consequence of a world where diplomatic communications were not archived in ways that both parties could later produce. What it cannot be read as is proof of anything in either direction. Here is what the silence actually tells us, and it is more interesting than either side's preferred version. In Anglo-Saxon political tradition, the throne was not automatically transferred by blood or by a previous king's promise. The Witan, the Council of Great Men, had genuine authority to choose among available candidates. They had done so before. What made a king legitimate in this tradition was not just bloodline or private conversation. It was the public consent of the men who governed. Harold had that consent, completely, publicly, on the day Edward was buried. William had a story about a promise from a decade earlier that the people closest to Edward had not seen fit to record. Two different systems, two different definitions of what legitimacy meant. Neither was irrational, neither was simply self-serving. They were built on genuinely different political traditions that had never before been forced to resolve their difference in this way. And then there was Harold in Normandy, 1064. He arrived on the Norman coast in circumstances the sources cannot agree on. The Norman account says Edward sent him specifically to confirm the succession promise to William in person. The version recorded by Edmer of Canterbury, an English monk writing a generation later, says Harold went for personal reasons, possibly to secure the release of family members held as hostages by William, and found himself in a situation where he had to swear something to get home. William received him. He treated him well. Harold accompanied William on a military campaign in Brittany, fought alongside Norman knights, and received arms from William in a ceremony that carried feudal meaning, the Lord equipping his man. Anyone watching that ceremony understood what it implied about the relationship between the two. Then came the oath, at Bayeux, or possibly Bonneville-sur-Touques. Harold swore on relics. The Norman sources are specific about what he swore. He would support William's claim to the English throne. He would serve as William's representative in England. He would help prepare the way for William's succession. The Bayeux Tapestry shows the moment with careful attention. Harold stands with his hands extended over two covered objects. His posture is formal. The artist gave him an expression that reads, "Across 950 years, as a man doing something he understands he cannot take back." Then the covers were removed. Underneath them were relics, the bones of Norman saints. Harold had sworn on the most binding foundation that the medieval imagination had available. And, in at least one version of the telling, he had done so without knowing quite what he was swearing on, until it was too late. Whether this version is true, whether the relics were hidden, whether William staged the reveal for maximum effect, is something the evidence cannot settle. What the evidence can settle is what William did with the oath. He sent an embassy to Pope Alexander II. He presented his case to Rome. Harold had broken a sacred oath, sworn before God on holy relics. Edward had promised him the throne. The English Church, under Stigand's irregular leadership, needed reform that only a properly sanctioned king could provide. His campaign was not a land grab. It was a just war, fought in the service of legitimate governance and ecclesiastical order. The Pope gave him a banner and his blessing. Think about what this meant in 1066. The Church was the international institution of European civilization. It was the framework within which every European ruler operated. Papal approval did not give William soldiers, but it gave his enterprise a moral legitimacy that crossed every border. Norman knights who followed him across the Channel were not mercenaries pursuing wealth in a foreign country. They were soldiers in a righteous cause, blessed by the highest authority in Christendom. It also meant that Harold, anointed King of England, with full English ecclesiastical support, was now fighting against a papally blessed army, which put his own church in an uncomfortable position that his opponents could exploit. William had turned a dispute about succession into a holy war. Harold had the better legal claim by English law. William had the better story. In 1066, the story was going to matter more than the law. One detail about the preparation of the Norman fleet that rarely receives the attention it deserves. Matilda commissioned a ship for William, the flagship of the Armada, called the Mora. Its prow was decorated with a figure of a child pointing toward England. Whether every detail of this is accurate matters less than what it represents. Matilda was not simply holding Normandy in William's absence. She was sending him toward England with a ship she had built, her name attached to the vessel leading the invasion, participating in the attempt not just as administrator but as co-architect. She believed it was going to work. The fleet gathered at the mouth of the Dives River through the summer of 1066. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, horses, which were expensive and difficult to transport by sea, and absolutely necessary for the kind of cavalry assault William was planning. The logistics of getting horses onto ships without injuring them, keeping them alive during the crossing, and landing them in condition to fight is one of the more underappreciated operational challenges of the entire enterprise. William waited for the wind. August passed. The wind stayed wrong, blowing from the north and northwest, directly against a crossing to England. The fleet moved up the coast to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, closer to the English coast. Men began dying of disease in the camps. Morale dropped in the way. Morale drops when soldiers have been prepared for action and then required to wait in poor conditions for weeks. William held the army together through daily religious observance, personal presence in the camps, and the specific authority of a man who had spent his life making waiting look like confidence rather than delay. He processed the relics of St. Valery publicly through the camp, asking for divine help with the weather, which was also a performance for his soldiers, a demonstration that he believed in the outcome enough to ask the saints for it. He believed, or he acted as if he believed, which in the situation he was in was effectively the same thing. On September 27th, the wind changed. Harold was in Yorkshire. His army had just won the most decisive military victory of his reign. He was 300 miles from the Sussex coast. His forces were exhausted and exhilarated, and 3 days' march from the Channel at minimum. The Mora pointed its child toward England and moved into the Channel. William crossed in the dark, arriving off the English coast before dawn. His ship outpaced the fleet, and he found himself alone on the water, unable to see the other ships behind him in the darkness. He ate a meal of spiced wine and food and waited for his army to catch up. A man eating in the dark in the middle of the English Channel, waiting for an army he could not see. On his way to claim a country that had not asked for him, he was not afraid. Or he did not show it. Or he had decided long ago that showing it was not something he could afford. He stepped off the boat at Pevensey on September 28th and stumbled on the beach. The men around him froze. A fall on landing was a bad omen, the kind of thing that could rattle an army that needed to believe in what it was doing. William grabbed 2 fists of English sand and stood up. He said, in the version that survived, that he had just seized England with both hands. Whether he said it or whether it was said for him afterward, it was the right thing at the right moment. The men around him relaxed. The story moved through the army before the day was out. He had turned a stumble into a statement. He had been doing that his entire life. Put William aside for a moment. Forget the Norman coast and the ships and the papal banner. Forget the oath and the relics and the story William had been assembling piece by piece into something that looked like divine mandate. Set all of that down and stand in England in the first week of January, 1066, and look at the situation from the other side. England had just chosen its king, not reluctantly, not provisionally. The Witan met on January 6th, the morning after Edward died, and chose Harold Godwinson with the speed of men who had already made the decision in every practical sense and were now simply making it official. He was crowned the same day, in Westminster Abbey, in the ceremony that Anglo-Saxon tradition required and recognized. This was not a coup. This was not an opportunist seizing a moment of confusion. This was a country's governing council doing exactly what it was designed to do, identifying the most capable available leader at a moment of genuine danger and putting him in place before the danger had time to organize against him. Harold Godwinson was 40 years old, give or take. He had been Earl of Wessex since his father Godwin's death in 1053. Wessex was not simply one earldom among several. It was the heartland of Anglo-Saxon England, the territory of Alfred the Great, the wealthiest and most populous region in the kingdom. The Earl of Wessex was, in practical terms, the second most powerful man in England. And in the years of Edward's increasing withdrawal from active governance, Harold had become the person England actually ran on. He had fought a successful campaign in Wales in 1063 and 1064, campaigning through winter conditions that most commanders avoided, using naval operations alongside land forces with a strategic sophistication that his era rarely demonstrated. He had destroyed the power of the Welsh king Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, who had been raiding English territory for years, and who had proved resistant to every previous attempt to contain him. Harold ended that problem permanently, in one season, using methods that showed he understood both the military and the political dimensions of the problem he was solving. He managed the relationships between the great earldoms, between Wessex and Mercia and Northumbria and East Anglia, with the patience of someone who understood that England's stability depended on keeping those regional powers in rough alignment rather than in open competition. This was not glamorous work. It did not produce monuments or memorable battles. It produced the specific, invisible stability of a system that is being continuously maintained by someone who knows what happens when it is not. When the Wheaton chose Harold, they were not gambling on an unknown. They were formalizing what had already been the practical reality for years. Harold was the most experienced, most trusted, most capable leader available. The Thengs who swore loyalty to him on January 6th were swearing to a man most of them had been working with for over a decade. This is the part of the story that the Norman version needs you to forget. Because if Harold was a legitimate king, chosen by legitimate process, ruling with genuine support, then William was not restoring order to a kingdom in chaos. He was invading a functioning country, which is exactly what he was doing. Now think about what Harold knew when he accepted the crown. He knew that William of Normandy had been building ships since spring and would cross the Channel the moment the weather allowed. He knew that Harald Hardrada of Norway had a claim, thin but backed by a large fleet, and had been making noises about pressing it. He knew that his own brother, Tostig, stripped of his earldom in Northumbria the previous year after a revolt against his governance, had been travelling the courts of Europe looking for someone who would give him an army and a reason. He accepted the crown anyway, not because he was reckless, because he looked at the situation and concluded that England needed a king who could actually govern and fight, and that any delay in establishing that king would cost more than it saved. He was right about that assessment. He just had no way of knowing that being right would not be enough. Harold set up a serious defensive posture almost immediately. He deployed naval forces in the Channel from at least May. He positioned his professional soldiers, the housecarls, in the south. He sent word to the northern earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, his brothers-in-law, to be ready to respond to whatever came from that direction. He was managing a two-front threat with the resources of a kingdom that had been at peace for decades and whose military systems were built for episodic mobilization rather than sustained readiness. He managed it as competently as it could be managed. The trouble with his brother Tostig ran deeper than a political falling out. Tostig Godwinson had been Earl of Northumbria until 1065. When the Northumbrian nobility rose against him in a revolt that accused him of arbitrary and oppressive governance, Harold faced a genuine crisis. His brother, a member of the family whose unity had been central to the Godwin political project for decades, was being rejected by his own earldom. Harold had to choose between family loyalty and political reality. He chose political reality. He supported the Northumbrian revolt. Tostig was stripped of his earldom and went into exile, replaced by Morcar, who was acceptable to the Northerners and whom Harold needed on his side. It was the right decision by any analysis. It was also the kind of decision that leaves a fracture that does not heal. Tostig spent the months after his exile looking for allies. He approached William. He approached Harald Hardrada of Norway. He was a man shopping his grievance to anyone who would fund an army to let him take back what he had lost. Hardrada listened. Harald Hardrada was 60 years old in 1066 and had spent most of those years being the most dangerous man in whatever room he was in. He had served as a commander in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, the elite force composed largely of Norsemen who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor. Before that, and after, he had fought across the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and the North Sea. He was the last great Viking king in the original sense, a man whose authority rested on personal force and the specific reputation that decades of successful violence builds. His claim to England rested on an agreement between previous Scandinavian and English kings that the English had no particular reason to honour and Hardrada had no particular reason to abandon. It was weaker than William's claim and considerably weaker than Harold's. But he had 300 ships, and he believed they were sufficient argument. He and Tostig sailed for England in late summer. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, moved to intercept. They met the Norwegian army at Gate Fulford, near York, on September 20th, 1066. They lost badly. York was open. The Norwegians moved in. The city submitted. Hardrada and Tostig accepted terms and waited for the hostages that would formalize the submission of the North. The news reached Harold in the south. He had disbanded his naval forces around September 8th, roughly 2 weeks earlier, because the summer had ended without William sailing and the men needed to go home. The system that kept the English military in the field was not built for sustained alert over months. The men who had been watching the Channel had farms and families and obligations they had been away from since spring. Harold moved north immediately. He covered 300 miles from London to Yorkshire in 4 days, picking up additional forces as he moved north, the local levies joining the column as it passed through their districts. He arrived at Tadcaster, 9 miles from York, on the evening of September 24th. The next morning, before dawn, he moved his army out. The Norwegians were at Stamford Bridge, 9 miles east of York, waiting for the hostages they expected. Hardrada had sent a large portion of his army back to the ships at Rickhall because it was a warm day and there was no reason to keep everyone in armour standing around a river crossing in the heat. The men at Stamford Bridge were resting. Many had left their mail coats with the ships. They looked west and saw an English army coming at them in the morning light. For a moment, the Norse sources record, they thought it was the local nobility bringing the agreed hostages. The glinting they saw in the distance could have been weapons. It could have been armour. It could have been the riders they were expecting. Then, It resolved into something unmistakable. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was not long, and it was not close. Harold's army hit Hardrada's unprepared forces with everything that surprise and speed could give them. Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian army was shattered so completely that, by the account of the sources, the survivors needed only 24 ships for the voyage home. Harold had saved England from a Viking invasion in a single afternoon. He had done it through speed and surprise, and the organizational capacity to move an army 300 miles and put it into combat the next morning. It was, by any honest military assessment, a brilliant operation. Ethelwig, Abbot of Evesham, heard about Stamford Bridge from a rider passing through Worcestershire 3 days later. He was in his scriptorium when the news came, reviewing accounts with one of the monastery's younger monks. He set the accounts aside and went to the chapel. He said a prayer for the dead on both sides. He said a longer prayer for the living. Then he went back to his accounts. He was a practical man. The monastery needed managing, regardless of what was happening on battlefields 300 miles away. That evening, he wrote a single line in his personal record. Harold has defeated the Norwegians. England holds. He did not write what he thought would happen next. He was not the kind of man who wrote down what he was afraid of. 2 days after Stamford Bridge, Harold received news from the south. William had sailed. The wind that had kept the Norman fleet in port since August had shifted on September 27th. The Armada had crossed the Channel and landed at Pevensey on September 28th. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, the full military apparatus of the most organized duchy in northern France, now ashore on the Sussex coast and beginning to move through the English countryside. Harold was in Yorkshire, 300 miles from Sussex. His army had been marching and fighting for 3 weeks. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine found him that evening. After the messengers had come, Gurth made the argument plainly. Wait. Rest the army. Give the kingdom time to mobilize a fresh force. Send Gurth south with the advance force while Harold organized the full English response from London. Even if the first engagement went badly, Harold would still have an army, and William would be weakened. Harold refused. The reasons he gave were partly strategic and partly something that does not have a clean strategic name. He was the king. That was his land being burned down in Sussex. Those were his people being raided. He had just won the greatest military victory of his career by moving fast and hitting hard before the enemy was ready. He intended to do it again. He was also, though he would not have put it this way, the kind of king who did not send other men to fight his battle while he organized from a safe distance. On October 2nd, 1 week after Stamford Bridge, Harold was back in London. He had covered 300 miles north, fought a major battle, and covered 300 miles south in 14 days. He spent 6 days in London gathering forces. Fresh levies came in from the surrounding counties. The housecarls were still there, steady as they had always been. The fyrd from the southern shires assembled with the speed of men who understood that the alternative to fighting now was watching their towns burn. On October 12th, Harold marched south. Ethelwig noted the army passing through the Midlands and recorded its size in his accounts with the careful attention of a man who understood that military strength passing through your territory was information worth keeping. He added one more line. Harold moves south to meet the Norman. He wrote nothing else. He closed the account book and went to evening prayers. He did not sleep well that night, though he would not have admitted that to anyone. Harold moved through the autumn countryside, the leaves turning, the roads packed by the movement of thousands of men and horses. He gathered forces as he went. By the time he reached the area near Hastings and took his position on the ridge, the English called Senlac Hill, on the evening of October 13th, he had an army of real size. Though the precise numbers, as with almost everything about this battle, exist only in sources that had reasons to manipulate them, he positioned his housecarls in the front ranks and set his shield wall, the Anglo-Saxon defensive formation that had stopped armies before, and waited for the morning. He had been king for 9 months and 4 days. What he was waiting for was not just William's army. He was waiting for the answer to the question that every person who has ever put everything they had into a single moment eventually faces. Whether it was going to be enough. Before Hastings, the oath. Not because the oath decided the battle. Swords decided the battle, but because the oath decided something larger, and understanding what it decided and how tells you more about the world William and Harold were living in than any account of shield walls and cavalry charges ever could. Harold Godwinson arrived on the Norman coast in 1064. The exact circumstances of his arrival are the first place the sources break apart. And they break apart in ways that are themselves instructive about what each side needed the story to be. The Norman account says Harold was sent by Edward the Confessor specifically to travel to Normandy and confirm the succession promise to William in person. This version makes Harold an agent of Edward's will, a messenger who came voluntarily to deliver a formal commitment on behalf of his king. The version recorded by Eadmer of Canterbury, an English monk writing in the generation after, says Harold went to Normandy for personal reasons, possibly to secure the release of family members held as hostages by William, and found himself in a situation where he had to swear something to get home. Each version of the arrival shapes everything that comes after. If Harold came as Edward's representative, the oath is a formal diplomatic act. If Harold came for personal reasons and was effectively trapped, the oath is something extracted under conditions that canon law had specific things to say about. William of Poitiers, the Norman chaplain who wrote the most detailed Norman account of these events, says Harold came voluntarily and eagerly, with every understanding of what he was agreeing to. What happened during Harold's time in Normandy is described with more consistency across the sources, even when the interpretation of what it meant varies completely. Harold accompanied William on a military campaign in Brittany. The Bayeux Tapestry shows this in considerable detail. Harold fighting alongside Norman knights, rescuing men from quicksand near Mont Saint-Michel, receiving arms from William in a ceremony that anyone watching would have understood as the Lord equipping his man. That image, William handing Harold weapons, was not a casual gesture. It placed Harold in a subordinate position relative to William in the visual language that the 11th century used for exactly this kind of relationship. Whether Harold understood what he was agreeing to by accepting those arms, or whether he accepted them because refusing in public in William's own court would have been an immediate and serious insult with immediate and serious consequences, is exactly the kind of question the sources cannot answer, because the sources were not interested in Harold's interior experience. Then came the ceremony, ad Bayeux. Harold placed his hands on a covered chest and swore. He swore to support William's claim to the English throne. He swore to help prepare the way for William's succession after Edward's death. William of Poitiers records that when Harold had finished, the covering was removed to reveal that the chest contained holy relics, the bones of Norman saints. Harold had sworn on the most binding possible foundation, and in this version, he had done so without fully knowing it until the moment of revelation had passed. The detail of the hidden relics appears only in the Norman sources. It has the specific quality of a detail constructed to make Harold's subsequent behavior look worse than it would otherwise look. If you want to frame Harold as a man who broke a sacred oath, making that oath unknowingly more binding than he realized, serves your narrative perfectly. Orderic Vitalis, who was the most honest historian the Norman world produced, recorded the oath and recorded the doubts about it. He noted that some people believed Harold had sworn under compulsion, that he had been effectively a prisoner with no real freedom to refuse. Orderic recorded this not to absolve Harold, but because he was a historian who understood that the official version and the complete version were not reliably the same thing. Orderic knew something about this from personal experience. He was the son of a Norman knight and an English woman. He was born in Shropshire in 1075, sent to the monastery of St. Evroult in Normandy at age 10, weeping as he left England, speaking little Norman French, being separated from his mother's country at an age when children do not choose their circumstances. He spent the rest of his life in that monastery, learning Latin and Norman French, and writing the most comprehensive history of the Norman period that any single author produced. He wrote about Harold's oath from the specific position of a man who had spent 60 years inside the world the conquest had created, who carried both sides of it in his own blood, and who had decided that accuracy was worth more to him than the comfort of a clean story. The question of whether the oath was legally valid was not simple, even by the standards of the 11th century. Canon law, the legal framework of the medieval church, was specific about oaths. An oath sworn freely, with full understanding, on sacred objects, was the most binding commitment a Christian could make. Breaking it was not a political offense. It was a sin against God, a violation of the structure of divine order. But canon law also recognized exceptions. An oath sworn under duress was not binding. An oath obtained through deception was not binding. An oath that required doing something morally wrong was not binding. If Harold swore freely and with full understanding, he broke a sacred oath when he accepted the crown in January 1066. If Harold swore under compulsion or deception, he was bound by nothing. Harold, when he accepted the crown, clearly believed himself to be in the second category. He did not hesitate. He did not send word to William, explaining his position. He was crowned the day after Edward died and began governing England as its legitimate king, without apparent internal conflict about what he had sworn in Normandy. This tells you something important about how Harold understood what had happened at Bayeux. He believed he had said words that William had demanded, under conditions that made refusal impossible. And he believed those words had no binding moral force. William believed the opposite. What William needed from the oath was not primarily its moral content. What he needed was its political usefulness. He sent ambassadors to Harold after the coronation, demanding that Harold honor the oath. Harold refused. The ambassadors returned to Normandy. William sent to Rome. The embassy to Pope Alexander II was one of the most consequential diplomatic missions of the 11th century. William presented his case without Harold present to offer a counter-argument. Harold did not send a counter-embassy, whether because he believed the Pope had no jurisdiction over English succession, or because he was managing too many immediate military threats to prioritize papal diplomacy, or because he simply did not move fast enough while William did. Rome heard one version. Rome blessed the invasion. The papal banner came to Normandy, the consecrated standard that would fly over the Norman army as it crossed the Channel, a ring containing a hair of St. Peter, the formal endorsement of the highest authority in Christendom. Now the Norman knights who followed William were not mercenaries in a foreign land grab. They were soldiers in a war that the Pope had declared just. Their participation was not just permissible, it was potentially meritorious. Harold, the anointed King of England, was fighting against an army that God's representative on earth had blessed. In the visual propaganda language of the Bayeux Tapestry, where Harold is shown swearing with his hands on relics, and then shown being crowned, and then shown as a figure under a comet that medieval people read as an omen of disaster. The sequence is unmistakable. A man who swore, a man who broke his oath, a man whom heaven warned, a man who died. The tapestry was made after the fact. It was made with the ending already known. The people who commissioned it could arrange the images to tell the story they wanted told. This is what William had always understood. The story about the event matters as much as the event itself. He had understood this since Falaise. He had constructed his legitimacy from whatever materials were available his entire life. An oath here, a church council there, a papal blessing when he could get it. And at each stage, he had understood that the story he built around the facts was the thing that people would actually live inside. Harold had the better legal claim by English law. William had the better story. In 1066, the story was going to matter more than the law. On the coast of Normandy, in late September, the Norman fleet was ready. The ships were loaded. The horses were aboard. Restless and difficult in the way that horses always are when they understand that their situation is wrong but cannot do anything about it. The men were ready in the specific way of men who have been prepared for action for months and are finally, after weeks of bad weather and disease in the camps, about to move. The papal banner was at the front. William looked at the Channel, the water that had separated England from everything William was for 40 years, was 30 miles wide at the narrowest point. On a clear day you could see England from the French coast as a dark line on the horizon. He had been looking at that line his whole life. Now the wind was right. Here is the thing about 1066 that the clean version of the story takes away from you. Nobody knew how it was going to end. This sounds obvious. Of course, nobody knew. But the felt uncertainty of it, the actual lived experience of a year in which 3 powerful men were each making decisions based on incomplete information about what the other 2 were doing, under pressure that increased every week, with no way to see what was coming next. That uncertainty gets erased the moment you know the outcome. And once it is erased, the year starts to look like a story moving toward its conclusion rather than what it actually was. A crisis. Unresolved. Shifting. Full of moments where the whole thing could have turned differently. 3 men. 1 throne. And a year that hung on weather. Start with Harold Hardrada, because history has been the least fair to him, and the unfairness matters. He was 60 years old in 1066, and had spent most of those years being one of the most effective military commanders alive. He had served in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, the elite force of Norse mercenaries who protected the Byzantine emperor, fighting across the Mediterranean and the eastern frontier with the kind of sustained competence that builds a specific and durable reputation. He had spent decades raiding and campaigning across the Baltic and the North Sea. He was the last of the great Viking kings in the original sense. Not a man performing a tradition, but a man who had lived it from the inside for his entire adult life. His claim to England rested on an agreement between King Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut of England in the 1040s, by which the survivor of the 2 would inherit the other's kingdom. Magnus died before he could press it. Sturluda inherited Norway and eventually decided the claim was worth pursuing by the legal standards of any system. His claim was weak. It required accepting the validity of an agreement that most English people had no reason to remember, and that the intervening decades had rendered practically irrelevant. He had 300 ships. In the political arithmetic of 1066, this made the claim considerably more interesting. He also had Tostig, Harold's exiled brother, who had been travelling European courts for months, looking for someone who would give him an army and a reason to use it. Tostig brought local knowledge of English defences and the specific vindictive energy of a man who had been publicly humiliated by his own family and had not finished accounting for it. Together they sailed for England in late summer. They raided along the Yorkshire coast, moved up the Humber estuary, and met the northern earls at Gate Fulford on September 20th. They won easily. Edwin and Morcar brought their forces out to meet the invasion and were defeated in a battle that broke the northern English army as an effective fighting force for the immediate future. York submitted. Terms were arranged. The north of England was operating. In those first days of late September 1066, under the assumption that Harold Hardrada was going to be the next king of England. Then Harold arrived, but before Stamford Bridge, hold the picture for a moment. 3 armies, 3 claims, 3 men making decisions without knowing what the others were doing. Harold, in those weeks of late summer, was watching the southern coast. He had his naval forces deployed in the Channel, his housecarls positioned in the south, his intelligence networks as good as a king in 1066 could make them. He was managing the known threat from Normandy while trying to track the less predictable threat from Norway. He disbands the navy on September 8th because the summer is over and the men need to go home. This is not negligence. This is the operational reality of a military system that cannot sustain indefinite deployment of part-time soldiers with obligations to their farms and families. He makes the call that the Channel threat has passed for the year. 2 weeks later, Hardrada is in the Humber. Harold moves north with everything he has. Now, look at what William is doing during exactly this period. He has been in his camp at St. Valery for weeks. His army is ready. His ships are loaded. His men have been prepared for a crossing since August. And the wind will not cooperate. The wind blows from the north and northwest, directly against a Channel crossing to England. Day after day, the situation in the camp deteriorates in the way that camps deteriorate when men are crowded together in poor conditions with no action to focus them. Disease moves through the ranks. Some men begin to talk about going home. A campaign that does not launch starts to look to the men who signed on for the promise of English land, like a promise that is not going to be kept. William holds the army together through presence and performance. He walks the camps. He speaks to the men. He conducts religious services with the kind of visible personal commitment that makes other people feel the seriousness of what they are undertaking. He processes the relics of St. Valery publicly through the camp, asking for divine help with the weather, which is also a message to his soldiers. The man leading this enterprise believes in it enough to ask the saints for it. He does not know that Harold has just won the greatest military victory of his career at Stamford Bridge. He does not know that Harold's army is exhausted from 3 weeks of hard marching and fighting. He does not know that Harold is about to make the decision to move south immediately rather than resting his forces. On September 27th, the wind changes. This is the hinge on which 1066 turns. And it is worth sitting with what kind of hinge it is. It is not strategy. It is not genius. It is not divine intervention, though the Norman sources were naturally inclined to describe it that way, given the relics and the prayers and the papal blessing. It is meteorology. A weather pattern shifted on a specific day in September 1066, and the result was that William crossed the Channel at the worst possible moment for Harold. If the wind had shifted 2 weeks earlier, Harold would have been on the southern coast with a rested army, his full forces deployed. Waiting, William would have landed against a prepared defensive line rather than an open beach. If the wind had shifted 2 weeks later, Harold would have had time to rest his army after Stamford Bridge, incorporate reinforcements from across England, and march south in better condition. The wind shifted on September 27th. William crossed on September 28th. Harold was in Yorkshire. History does not always look like destiny from the inside. From the inside, William spending weeks in a camp watching men get sick while the wind refused to cooperate was not a strategic masterstroke. It was frustrating, costly, and entirely outside his control. The thing that won England was not his planning, but a change in the weather at the specific moment when it would cause the maximum damage to his opponent. From the outside, looking back with the knowledge of what happened, it looks inevitable. It looks like the pieces moving into place. It looks like the story building toward its conclusion. It was not a story building toward a conclusion. It was 3 men making real-time decisions in conditions they could not fully see, and one of those men happened to have the weather go right for him at exactly the right time. Now look at what Harold was managing in London in the 6 days between his return from Stamford Bridge on October 2nd and his departure south on October 12th. Fresh levies were coming in from the surrounding counties. The housecarls were there, steady as they had always been. Gurth and Leofwine were there, making the argument for waiting. Gurth's case was solid. Rest the army. Let reinforcements arrive from across the kingdom. Send Gurth south first to slow William, while Harold organised a larger force behind him. Even if Gurth lost the first engagement, Harold would still have an army, and William would be weakened and facing a fresh English force. Harold looked at it and said no. The south was burning. William had been moving through Wessex, Harold's home territory, for 2 weeks. His foraging parties were systematically destroying the countryside that Harold's family had built their power on for generations. His people were being killed and taken, and their livestock was being driven away. And Harold was the king. He was the king in the Anglo-Saxon sense that meant something specific and personal, the person responsible for the protection of the people who had given him their loyalty. Waiting in London while his land burned felt, to Harold, like failing at the thing that defined what a king was. He also believed, with the specific confidence of a man who had just won at Stamford Bridge through speed and surprise, that the same approach would work against William. Move fast. Hit hard. Catch the Norman before he was fully consolidated. This was not irrational. It had just worked spectacularly 3 weeks earlier. The problem was that William was not Hardrada, and the situation at Senlac Hill was not going to be Stamford Bridge. Harold marched south on October 12th with an army that was part veteran and part fresh, part rested and part still carrying the fatigue of the previous 3 weeks in their bones. He moved through the autumn countryside with the speed he always moved at, gathering forces as he went, the column growing as local levies from the southern shires joined in. He took his position on Senlac Hill on the evening of October 13th. He set his shield wall. He looked south toward the Norman camp at Hastings. William received news that Harold was approaching. He called his officers together that evening and told them what the morning would require. Then he was alone. The night before, Hastings is not recorded in any source with the kind of detail that would allow you to know what William did or thought in those hours. What the sources give you is the morning the army moving out before dawn, the papal banner at the front, the knights making their confession to the priests who moved through the camp, the horses being readied in the dark. But the night was there, and William had spent it somewhere between those preparations. He had crossed a sea. He had landed on a beach and grabbed its sand in his fists. He had spent 2 weeks burning a country to force its king to come to him. And now the king was coming. Everything William had built from Falaise to this hillside in Sussex was about to be tested in a single day. Not just his army, not just his tactics, not just the papal blessing and the story about the oath. Everything. The bastard who had learned to sleep in different places to stay alive. The duke who had waited out 3-year sieges. The man who had turned a stumble into a statement because he understood that the story about the event was the event. All of it was going to be decided on that ridge in the morning. He could not control the outcome. He had prepared everything that could be prepared. He had built everything that could be built. He had made every alliance, told every story, constructed every argument that the situation allowed. What he could not do was make the sun come up any differently than it was going to come up. He had known this about power his entire life. The specific loneliness of the person at the top who understands that all the preparation in the world does not eliminate the moment when you simply do not know. The night passed. The sun came up. The armies moved toward each other. September 25th, 1066. Before Hastings. This. Harold's army emerged from the forest west of Stamford Bridge in the early morning, and the Norse sentries on the west bank of the River Derwent saw them coming. For a moment, according to the Norse sources, there was genuine confusion about what they were looking at. The glinting in the morning light could have been weapons, or it could have been the decorative trappings of the delegation they were waiting for. Hardrada had arranged for the submission of the North. He was expecting hostages and formal acknowledgement from the local English nobility. What he was not expecting was an English army that had covered 300 miles in 4 days. The confusion lasted long enough to matter. The Norwegian forces at Stamford Bridge were divided. A large portion of the army was back at the ships at Rickall, 9 miles south. Because it was a warm day, and there had been no sign of any English military response, and keeping everyone in full armour at a river crossing in the September heat seemed unnecessary. The men at the bridge were resting. Some had left their mailcoats with the ships. Harold hit them before they could organise. What followed was not a battle in the sense of 2 prepared forces meeting at an agreed point. It was the destruction of an unprepared army by a force that had been moving at controlled speed for 4 days and was now, in the final miles, moving at the kind of speed that only comes when the objective is in sight. Hardrada was killed. The sources differ on exactly how and where, but agree that he died on the field, which was the thing that mattered. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian army, caught between the river and an English force attacking from the west, broke. The survivors ran for the ships. They made it. 300 ships had brought the invasion force across the North Sea. 24 ships carried the survivors home. Harold had destroyed the Norwegian threat in a single afternoon. He had done it through speed, through surprise, through the organisational capacity to move an army from London to Yorkshire in 4 days and put it into combat the morning after arrival. He had done it with the specific efficiency of a commander who understood that the window of advantage created by surprise is narrow and that using it required moving before the advantage could close. Standing on the field at Stamford Bridge that evening, Harold had done something genuinely remarkable. He had eliminated the most immediate military threat to his kingdom in a way that should have given him time to prepare properly for the second one. It did not give him time because the second threat had already moved. 2 days. That was the gap between Stamford Bridge and the news of William's landing. 2 days in which Harold had won the battle, secured the field, begun organizing the aftermath, and started to believe that the worst was behind him. Then a rider came from the south. The Norman army was ashore at Pevensey. 2 days ago, they had been moving through Sussex since they landed. Harold stood with this information and made his calculation. His army was tired. Stamford Bridge had cost him men he could not replace immediately. The housecarls who had survived were the best soldiers in England, and they had just marched 300 miles and fought a major battle and would need time before they were fully ready again. The furred levies who had joined the column coming north were in varying states of readiness depending on when they had joined and how hard they had pushed. He had won the battle he had come for. He had 300 miles to cover to reach the next one. And the countryside of Wessex, his own territory, his family's territory, was being burned while he stood on a battlefield in Yorkshire, calculating. He went south. The decision has been argued about for 960 years. The historians who believe Harold should have waited point to the obvious 2 more weeks of rest, proper reinforcement from across England, a fresh army moving south with full preparation. The historians who defend the decision point to the strategic logic of denying William time to consolidate his position, and to the political reality that a king who waited in safety while his home territory burned was demonstrating something about what kind of king he was. Both arguments have merit. Neither can be settled because we can only know what happened, not what would have happened if Harold had chosen differently. What we know is this. On October 2nd, Harold was back in London, 14 days after Stamford Bridge, covering 300 miles south with a force that had just covered 300 miles north and fought a battle in between. 6 days in London. Fresh levies arriving. Arguments from Girth and Leowine to wait. Harold refusing. On October 12th, the army moved south. Harold moved through the English countryside he had been governing for over a decade, past towns and fields and churches that had been part of his world his entire life. The south of England in October. The leaves already turning. The harvest in. The roads carrying the specific weight of an army that is not marching toward something abstract, but toward the defense of ground that everyone in the column could identify personally. These men were not fighting for a claim. They were fighting for this. The ridge at Senlac was chosen with the same tactical instinct that had served Harold at Stamford Bridge. High ground, a narrow front that reduced the advantage of William's larger force. Steep slopes that would slow and tire cavalry before they reached the English line. He set his shield wall in the last hours of October 13th. 9,000 men, give or take. Housecarls in the front ranks with their Danish axes, and their mail, furred behind them with spears and shields, and the specific determination of men defending the ground they are standing on. Harold at the centre with his household troops. The professional core of the English military. The best of what England had. Across the valley, William's army was moving into its overnight camp. The night passed in the way that nights pass before large battles. Men who cannot sleep thinking about what is coming. Men who sleep because they have learned to sleep when they can. Priests moving through the Norman camp, hearing confessions. The specific sounds of thousands of men and horses settling into a field in the October dark. William was somewhere in that darkness. Organizing, preparing, managing the 100 operational details that a battle requires someone to manage. Harold was on the ridge. 2 men who had been moving toward each other since January, across months and miles and decisions and events that neither fully controlled, were now separated by a valley and a few hours of night. In the morning, The distance between them would finally close. Harold on his ridge, William in his camp, the October sky going dark above them both. October 14, 1066. Down. The sun came up over the Sussex Downs into a sky the sources describe as clear. It was a Saturday. Cold, in the way English October mornings are cold. The kind that gets into armour and stays there. That makes hands stiff and breath visible, and every physical task slightly harder than it would be in better conditions. Harold's army had been on the ridge since the previous evening. Some of them had slept. Most had not. Which is what happens when men know what the morning is bringing and cannot make the mind stop working through it. The shield wall was set before full light. The housecarls were in the front ranks. These were the professionals, men who had trained for exactly this, their entire adult lives, who maintained their weapons and their fitness and their tactical knowledge, the way any serious specialist maintains the tools of a serious trade. They carried the two-handed Danish axe, a weapon capable of cutting through a horse's neck in a single swing. They wore mail coats and helmets. They had been fighting together long enough that the men to their left and right were as familiar as family. Behind them stood the fyrd, farmers, craftsmen, minor landowners who had answered the king's summons and arrived with whatever equipment they had. Some were well equipped. Some were not. All of them were standing on a ridge in Sussex, because the king had called, and because this was their land being burned below them, and because whatever else a man in 1066 was, he was connected to the ground under his feet in a way that made defending it feel less like a choice than a fact. Harold was at the centre with his household troops and his brothers Gurth and Leofwine on his flanks. He looked south. The Norman army came out of the morning light from the direction of Hastings, moving up the lower ground toward the ridge in 3 divisions. The left was Breton and Allied. The right was Franco-Flemish. The mercenaries and volunteers who had come from across northern France for the papal blessing and the promise of English land. The centre was Norman, William's own men, and William himself was there, commanding in person from the position of greatest authority and greatest danger. In front of the main divisions were the archers. Behind the archers, heavy infantry. Behind the infantry, the cavalry. It was a force built for exactly this kind of engagement. The archers to weaken the English line, the infantry to engage it and pin it, the cavalry to exploit any break, to hit the flanks, to finish what the other 2 arms started. 3 elements working together in the sequence that Norman military doctrine had developed and refined across decades of continental warfare. The archers went first. They advanced up the slope and released their arrows at the English line. The results were limited. The shield wall was designed for exactly this. A continuous surface of overlapping shields behind which men crouched and angled themselves to reduce exposure. The slope also worked against the archers, requiring a trajectory that reduced the force of arrows by the time they arrived. The English line held. The archers fell back. The infantry went next. The collision when the 2 lines met was audible from a long distance. The specific sound of thousands of men with weapons hitting thousands of men with shields. A noise that has no peacetime equivalent, and that the sources describe with the particular attention of people who had heard it and wanted to make sure the description did not fail the reality. The English line held. This was not surprising to anyone who understood what the shield wall was capable of. It was built for this moment, for absorbing the energy of a frontal assault and converting it into stalemate. The housecarls in the front ranks were doing what they had trained to do, maintaining the formation. using the axes to keep the ground in front of them clear, trusting the men beside them the way you trust the people you have trained with, long enough that their movements are as predictable as your own. The Norman infantry pushed. The English line absorbed. The infantry pushed again. The English line held again. After perhaps an hour, the Norman left collapsed. The Bretons broke. The reasons for it are not fully recoverable from the sources. The Breton contingent was the weakest element of William's army in terms of their commitment to his specific enterprise. They were fighting for their own reasons, which were partly ideological and partly about the promise of land in England, and the specific calculation that men make in the middle of a battle that is not going their way is not recorded anywhere. What is recorded is the result. The Bretons ran. Running in medieval battle was contagious in a way that is difficult to convey. When one section of a formation broke, the men next to it saw people running, and the instinct to follow was immediate and powerful. The Franco-Flemish on the right also began to waver. The entire Norman line was suddenly moving in the wrong direction. Part of the English line followed. This was the moment every experienced commander on Harold's side would have told his men to resist, because it was the moment the shield wall stopped being a wall. Some of the English infantry, third, men in particular, moved down the slope after the retreating Normans, breaking their formation, separating themselves from the ridge, doing the thing that medieval infantry was most catastrophically prone to doing when it believed it was winning. They chased. Now look at the battle from William's position. He was in the centre, and the centre was also moving backward. Whether this was genuine retreat or the controlled withdrawal that later sources call a feigned retreat is one of the genuinely unresolvable debates of the battle. The honest answer is that it was probably different things in different parts of the field at the same time. Some units may have retreated in genuine disorder and found themselves reforming by accident or by the instinct of veteran soldiers. Other units may have executed something closer to a deliberate withdrawal with the intention of turning. The chaos of a collapsing battle line does not produce uniform behavior. It produces a range of responses. And the difference between a feigned retreat and a genuine one may only have been visible in retrospect to the men who survived it. What is not in dispute is what happened to the English infantry that came down the slope. They were caught in the open by Norman cavalry, without the shield wall, without the formation that made the axemen effective, without the space and the structure that the ridge had provided. Individual infantry against mounted knights was not a difficult problem to solve. They were killed, but the main English line on the ridge had not broken. Harold's position was still there. His housecarls were still there. The ridge was still held. The Norman army was reforming at the bottom of the slope. The battle continued. There is an account, present in multiple sources, that William was unhorsed at some point during this phase of the fighting, that his horse was killed under him, possibly a second horse as well, and that he had to tear his helmet off to show his face to his men and prove he was still alive. Whether every detail is precisely as recorded, or whether dramatic details accumulate around important battles in the telling, the underlying reality it points to is credible. William was the battle. His army was fighting for a specific person and a specific claim and a story they had been told about God's will. And if that person was killed, or rumoured killed, every element of the enterprise would have dissolved immediately. He needed to be visible. He needed to be seen still fighting. He survived. He showed his face. He kept his army in the field. The afternoon came. The English line was still there. But it was not the same line it had been in the morning. The housecarls who had been killed had been replaced by men one level less capable. The third, who had chased the Norman retreat and been cut down on the open slope, had left gaps that were filled by men with less training and less equipment. The formation was thinner, and thinness in a shield wall is a different thing from what it is in most structures. In most structures, thin means weakened. In a shield wall, thin means the possibility of collapse. The Norman archers shifted their angle in the afternoon. Instead of shooting flat into the wall of shields, they sent their arrows in a high arc, falling from above rather than hitting from the front. This forced the men in the wall to hold their shields overhead rather than forward, changing their posture, reducing what they could see directly in front of them, making the work of maintaining the formation harder in a way that accumulated over time. Harold was hit. The image from the Bayeux Tapestry of a man labelled Harold with an arrow near his face is one of the most famous images in English history, and one of the most debated, whether Harold was killed by an arrow, by a sword, by a combination of blows from Norman knights who reached him after the line around him began to give way, is something the sources cannot definitively settle. The tapestry shows what it shows, and historians have been arguing about exactly what that is for 200 years. What is not in dispute is that Harold died on the field. He died on the ridge at Senlac in the afternoon of October 14th, 1066, commanding his army in person as the kind of king who does not leave the field while his men are still fighting on it. When he died, the English line broke. The housecarls fought around his body until they too were gone. The Fyrd dispersed into the gathering dusk. The Norman cavalry pursued the retreating English into the woodland beyond the ridge, killing the men they caught in the specific relentless way of a cavalry force pursuing infantry that has no more formation to protect it. By evening, it was over. The battle had lasted roughly 9 hours. William came to the ridge. He set up his tent on the highest point of the English position, on the ground where Harold had commanded his army, on the exact spot where Harold's standard had flown. This was deliberate. In the visual language of medieval warfare, occupying the enemy commander's ground was a statement about who owned the outcome and what that ownership meant going forward. He ate his evening meal there, on the ridge, surrounded by the dead, 3 miles away, in a village whose name is not recorded. A woman, whose name is also not recorded, heard the sound of the Norman cavalry coming through in the dark. She had been there when the English army marched past the previous morning. She had watched the soldiers go by with the attention of someone who understood that the movement of armed men in a particular direction was information worth reading. Now she heard the same sound, coming back from a different direction. And the sound was different. Not the organized movement of an army with a destination. The scattered, urgent movement of men who had been routed and were looking for whatever safety the darkness could provide. She pulled her children away from the doorway and into the back of the house. She waited. The sounds passed through and faded. She stayed where she was until full dark. And then, a little longer, until the sounds were gone and the village was quiet. Then she went to the doorway and looked out at the road. She did not know who had won. She would not know until morning, or until someone came through the village and told her. She went back inside. She had survived the day. Tomorrow would require its own surviving. This is the thing about Hastings that the military histories tend to miss, not through dishonesty but through the necessary focus of their subject. The battle was fought by specific men making specific decisions in a specific valley in Sussex on a specific October afternoon, but it landed on everyone in range. On the woman in the village who did not know the outcome until morning, on Ethelwig in Worcestershire who would receive the news in 3 days, On the third, soldiers who survived and were walking home through the dark. On the Norman knights who had won and were now facing the question of what winning actually meant in a country that had not asked to be won. Ethelwig received the news on October 17th. A rider came through Evesham, carrying reports south and west. The rider was moving fast. He stopped only long enough to exchange horses and deliver the message he was carrying. Ethelwig heard it in the yard of the monastery. He did not move for a moment after the rider left. Then he went inside and called his monks together in the chapel. He said the prayers for the dead. He said Harold's name among them. Then he went to his study and sat at his desk and thought about what this meant for everything he had built. The question was not abstract. He had spent 30 years building Evesham into one of the most functional religious institutions in central England. He had accumulated land and relationships and institutional memory that served the surrounding community in ways that had made the monastery valuable, regardless of who held political power at the national level. That value was about to be tested in ways he could not yet fully see. He picked up his pen. He wrote in his personal record, "Harold is dead. The Norman has won at Hastings. What comes next is not yet known." He put down the pen. He had one more thing to do before the day ended. He went back to the chapel and said the prayers again. More slowly this time. Not for Harold specifically. For everyone. Then he went to bed. The monastery would need managing in the morning. It had always needed managing in the morning. That was not going to change, regardless of who was King of England. William stayed on the ridge for several days after the battle, a decision that served both strategic and symbolic purposes. He was consolidating his position, assessing his own losses, organizing the Norman forces that had now become an occupying army rather than an invasion force. He was also waiting. He was waiting to see what England was going to do. England had a dead king, a shattered army, and a Norman duke sitting on the ridge where the king had died. The question was what it was going to do about all three of those facts simultaneously. The answer was not going to come quickly. It was not going to be clean, but it was coming. William looked out from the ridge over the Sussex countryside in the morning light of October 15th. The fields were still. The smoke from the previous days of Norman foraging was visible on the horizon. The bodies of the men who had died on the ridge were being sorted by the survivors. He had won the battle. He had not won England. Those two things were not the same, and he knew it. England was a country with deep administrative roots, strong regional identities, a church with real institutional independence, and a population that had just watched its king die on a hill and had not yet decided what that meant for their own choices. What he did next was going to determine whether October 14th was the end of Anglo-Saxon England or the beginning of a very long argument about who owned it. He began moving north. He burned as he went. The smoke rose above the autumn fields of Kent and Surrey and Wessex, visible for miles in every direction, carrying a message that did not require translation into any language. The message was, "I am here. I am not leaving. And the question is not whether I rule England. The question is what it is going to cost you to make me prove it." London had not yet decided. This is the part of the story that gets compressed into a single sentence in most tellings. William won at Hastings. William became king. Christmas Day. Westminster Abbey. Done. 10 weeks. Erased. But those 10 weeks were not a formality. They were a negotiation conducted through smoke and fear, and the specific political language of a country trying to determine whether it had any choices remaining. England still had institutions. The Witan still existed. Edwin and Morcar, the northern earls, were alive and still commanded genuine loyalty in their regions. The Church retained its hierarchy, its lance, and the moral authority that made it more than a ceremonial decoration on political reality. London itself, the wealthiest and most commercially active city in England, had walls and a population and the specific stubbornness of a place that knows it matters too much to be simply burned down and forgotten. When Harold died at Hastings, England did not transfer automatically to William. It had to be taken. William understood this better than most. He had spent his entire life watching the gap between formal authority and real control. Watching what happened when the people responsible for making a system function decided that their interests lay elsewhere. He was not going to assume that one military victory settled the question. He moved east from Hastings toward Dover first, not directly toward London. Dover controlled the most important crossing point between England and the continent. Taking it secured his supply line home and made retreat, if retreat became necessary, a genuine option rather than a catastrophe. It was the decision of a man who did not assume the best outcome and did not leave himself without alternatives if the situation required adjustment. Dover surrendered without significant resistance. Canterbury, the ecclesiastical capital of England, surrendered next. William was moving around London rather than toward it, cutting its connections to the south and east, making it progressively more isolated without the cost and uncertainty of attacking a defended city. The logic was the same logic he had used in Normandy during the 3-year siege at Rouen: make the cost of continuing to resist higher than the cost of ending it, and wait for the other side to make the calculation. Inside London, the calculation was happening. The Witan met after Hastings and did what their tradition required. They chose a king, Edgar Atheling, a boy of about 15, with the strongest legitimate blood claim in England, a direct descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line running back to Alfred the Great. His grandfather had been Edmund Ironside. His bloodline was beyond question. His capacity to defend that bloodline was nearly non-existent. He was 15 years old. He had no military experience. The army that might have defended his claim had been broken at Hastings. Edwin and Morcar pledged support and moved no soldiers. Stigand the Archbishop pledged support. Ealdred of York pledged support. London pledged support. For a period of weeks in November 1066, England had a king who was not William. William continued burning. He moved west and then north, completing the encirclement of London, destroying the agricultural land that fed it. His army swept through Surrey and Hampshire, taking livestock, burning storage, cutting the roads that kept the city supplied. The fires were visible from the city walls on clear days. Inside London, the coalition around Edgar was doing the arithmetic that coalitions do when the situation is genuinely dire. The Northern Earls had pledged support and had not sent armies. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had blessed the resistance, had a contested ecclesiastical standing that Rome had not resolved in his favour. The city could be defended, but defending it against an army willing to destroy the countryside surrounding it meant a siege that would eventually produce the same result as an assault, just more slowly and with more suffering for the people trapped inside. On by on, the pieces of the coalition began to move toward a different calculation. Stigand came to William at Wallingford, then the Northern Earls, then the bishops, then Edgar himself, a teenager who had been placed in an impossible position by men who needed a symbol and was now being presented with the option of ending the situation at a cost he could afford to pay rather than continuing it toward a cost he could not. He came to William at Berkhamsted, with whatever dignity a 15-year-old boy can carry, when he is surrendering the throne his family's blood entitled him to, because the alternative was worse for everyone, including himself. William received them. He received them the way a king receives those who submit, which is not as equals negotiating terms, but as people acknowledging what the situation has already decided. London submitted. William moved to the city and prepared for the coronation. The date was Christmas Day, 1066. Westminster Abbey, Edward the Confessor's church, consecrated just a year earlier, the building where Harold had been crowned at the beginning of his 9-month reign. The choice was not accidental. William was not going to be crowned in Normandy or in some neutral space. He was going to be crowned in the most important religious building in England, in the building that Edward had built, in the building where Harold had stood. Occupying the same physical space was part of the argument he was making. He was not replacing England. He was inheriting it. This was the story. Christmas morning, 1066. Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was conducted by Ealdred, Archbishop of York, rather than Stigand, because Stigand's standing with Rome made him a liability in a coronation that needed to look as legitimate as possible. Ealdred had no such complications. He was respected by the Pope. He could perform this ceremony in a way that Rome would recognize. The abbey, filled with people, Norman lords who had crossed the Channel and fought at Hastings, and were now waiting to discover what England was going to mean for them in practical terms. English bishops and thegans who had submitted at Berkhamsted and were calculating, in the way that experienced people calculate when options have narrowed, how to position themselves usefully within the new order. Clergy who served the abbey and who had served whoever was crowned there for as long as the building had been standing. Ealdred asked the assembled English, in their language, whether they accepted William as their king. The Norman clergy asked the assembled Normans, in French, whether they accepted William. Both groups shouted their assent. The shout was very loud, louder than anyone had planned for. Inside the stone building, the voices of several hundred people, affirming in 2 languages simultaneously, created a sound that carried through the walls and into the street. The Norman guards, posted outside the abbey, heard it. They had been positioned there to maintain order in a city that had not entirely finished grieving its previous king, and that had Norman soldiers in it for the first time in its history. They were in a foreign country, in a city whose language most of them did not speak, guarding a building from which loud and unexpected sounds were now emanating. They responded the way soldiers respond when they are frightened and have weapons and no clear information about what the threat is. They began setting fire to the buildings around the abbey. The logic was the logic of men making a fast decision with incomplete information: create a perimeter, send a visible signal, do something physical in response to a threat that cannot be assessed from outside a stone wall. Inside the abbey, people began to smell smoke. They heard the noise from outside. They began to leave. First a few, then more. Then the general movement toward exits that happens when a crowd inside a building decides that outside is safer than inside, regardless of what is actually happening outside. The ceremony continued. By the time Ealdred placed the crown on William's head, most of the congregation had gone. The abbey was largely empty. The man being crowned, according to the sources that recorded the day, was visibly shaking, whether from cold or the weight of the moment, or some other response to standing in a half-empty church with fires burning outside. The image survived in the sources because it felt true to the day. Outside, the fires were already being put out. The damage was real but not catastrophic. The guards had panicked, not strategized. The city was not burning down. The people who had fled the abbey were coming back to look at what had happened and then going home. Orderic Vitalis, writing about this moment several decades later, described it with the careful attention of a man who understood that what had happened in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, was worth recording precisely because it was not the triumphant moment it was supposed to be. He noted the fires. He noted the emptied church. He noted the shaking. He did not explain what these things meant. He was a historian who understood that sometimes the most honest thing you can do with a significant moment is describe it accurately and let the reader sit with what it implies. What it implied was this: William had his crown. Ealdred had placed it on his head in the correct church with the correct ceremony. He was the anointed king of England. And anointed kings in the 11th century carried a sacred status that was genuinely difficult to challenge on principle. He was the anointed king of England in a building that the congregation had run away from, in a city surrounded by soldiers who had just set fire to it, out of fright, in a country where the population had not been consulted about any of this, and where the men who had submitted at Berkhamsted had submitted because the alternative was worse, not because they had changed their minds about who should govern them. He had the crown. He had not been chosen, and he knew the difference. He had always known the difference. The entire architecture of his claim, the papal blessing, the oath, the story about Edward's promise, all of it had been built to address exactly this gap, to fill the space between having the crown and having the consent that would make the crown mean something beyond the fact of force. He had not filled it. He had constructed a very good argument for why the crown was legitimately his. He had not made England believe the argument. That was going to be the work of the next 20 years. Or, more precisely, it was going to be the work that never quite finished. The gap that all the castles and all the Domesday surveys and all the administrative reorganization of an entire country would try to close, and would not fully close before he died, on a floor in Rouen with his servant's footsteps, fading down the corridor. Ethelwig of Evesham celebrated Christmas in his monastery in Worcestershire, as he did every year, with the full liturgical observance that the season required. The prayers were said. The communal meal was served. The institutional routine of a large religious house continued with the self-sustaining momentum of something that had been operating for long enough that it knew how to keep running. He had heard about the coronation. He had not attended. Abbots in the Midlands did not travel to London on short notice for the coronation of a king who had not requested their presence. He thought about what it meant. He was a practical man. The questions he was asking were practical. Who was William going to put in charge of what? What was going to happen to the land arrangements that sustained this monastery? What did a Norman king mean for the relationship between the English church and the English crown that had been built across generations? He did not know the answers. He went back to work. William spent the first weeks of his reign in London, doing what newly crowned kings do when the crown is contested. He confirmed some existing arrangements. He made promises to the English clergy and nobility about respecting their rights. He projected, as far as the situation allowed, the image of a king who intended to govern England as England expected to be governed, rather than as a territory to be stripped. Some of these promises were genuine. Some were tactical. In the compressed reality of the first weeks after a violent succession, the line between genuine and tactical was not always visible, even to the man making the promises. He returned to Normandy in February 1067, less than 2 months after his coronation. Normandy still needed governing, and William needed to be present in his original territory, to demonstrate that acquiring England had not meant abandoning the duchy that was the foundation of everything. He left England in the care of Odo of Bayeux, his half-brother, and William Fitz-Osbern, one of his most trusted Norman lords. England began testing its new situation almost immediately. The specific form of the testing was not organized military resistance. Not yet. It was the quieter resistance of people who have been forced into a position and who are continuously evaluating whether it can be reversed. Locale conspiracies, acts of harassment against Norman garrisons, the withdrawal of cooperation from the administrative processes that required English participation to function. Odo and Fitz-Osbern dealt with these, the way men deal with problems when they have been given authority in a hostile environment and understand that showing any weakness will be read as permission to push harder. They were not wrong about that reading, but the specific harshness of their responses was building something that William, had he been present, might have managed differently, not because he was gentle, but because he was strategic. And strategy required understanding that a country being systematically antagonized was a country building toward the kind of organized resistance that would be more expensive to suppress than the scattered difficulties that provoked it. William was in Normandy. He came back in December 1067. He came back to a country that had been managed in his absence with the specific competence of men who were very good at maintaining control and not particularly interested in the difference between maintaining control and maintaining the penus, conditions under which control could be permanent. The North had not yet been dealt with. The North was about to demonstrate what happened when the people who had submitted at Berkhamsted decided that submission had been a mistake. There is a tower in London that has been standing for nearly 1,000 years. You can visit it today. Millions of people do every year, walking through the same gate that prisoners walked through, standing in the same courtyards where executions took place, looking up at the same stone walls, built on the orders of a man who had just become king of a country that had not asked for him, and understood that the most urgent question was not how he had won, but how he intended to stay. The White Tower, the central keep of what we now call the Tower of London, was begun around 1078. Its walls are 4 meters thick in places. It was built from Caen stone, quarried in Normandy, and shipped across the Channel at enormous expense. He did not build it from English stone. He built it from Norman stone, carried across the same water he had crossed with his army. Because the tower was not just a building. It was a statement about where authority came from and what it looked like when it had decided to stay permanently. But the Tower of London was the culmination of a process that had begun the moment William's army stepped off the boats at Pevensey. Before Domesday, before any of the legal and administrative structures that would define the Norman transformation of England, before any of it, there were castles. The Motte and Bailey design the Normans brought to England was not complicated in concept. A motte was a mound of earth, sometimes natural and often constructed, raised as high as possible and compacted until it could support a structure. A bailey was an enclosed yard at the base of the motte, surrounded by a wooden palisade. On top of the motte stood a tower, initially wooden, eventually stone, from which a small garrison could observe the surrounding territory and project a presence that required no ongoing action to maintain. The design was simple. The effect was not. A Motte and Bailey castle could be built in weeks, which meant that in the months and years after Hastings, communities across England that had never seen anything like this found that an earthen mound had appeared on the edge of their town, or on the high ground above their fields, or at the river crossing that their market depended on. and that men with Norman accents and Norman weapons were living on top of it, not passing through, not camping, living. Castle building, after the conquest, expanded rapidly across England, and the evidence of it is everywhere in the landscape today. In the earthwork, humps in fields, in the place names that preserve the word castle, in locations where stone buildings were long ago erased by time, in the patterns of Norman settlement that the Domesday survey would later record. Hundreds of these structures went up in the 2 decades following Hastings, some temporary and some permanent, some that were replaced by stone keeps and some that survived only as earthworks. Stand in a Norman castle and look out. You can see the fields, you can see the roads, you can see the river crossings, you can see who is coming before they arrive, and they can see you, which was the secondary purpose, and in some ways the more important one. A garrison of 20 men on top of a motte is not enough to defeat an uprising, but it is enough to make an uprising visible before it organizes. And visible uprisings are easier to manage than invisible ones. The castle on the hill said something in a language that needed no translation. It said, "I am here. I am watching. I am not leaving. And removing me is going to cost more than whatever you think you gain by trying." Ethelwig of Evesham watched the castles appear across the Midlands with the careful attention of a man whose institutional survival depended on reading the landscape accurately. He was not a soldier. He had not been a soldier for a moment of his life. He was an abbot managing one of the most important religious houses in central England, an institution that had been accumulating land and relationships and records for generations, that served its surrounding community in ways that made it valuable to whoever held political power at the national level. He understood that value was his protection. The new Norman lords arriving in the Midlands needed things that Ethelwig's monastery could provide: literacy, legal expertise, knowledge of local land arrangements that went back decades, arrangements that a Norman knight newly arrived from France with a grant of land and no knowledge of local conditions needed desperately, access to the networks of local relationships that Ethelwig had spent 30 years building. He made himself useful. This was not enthusiasm for the conquest. It was the practical understanding that an institution that makes itself necessary to power survives, and an institution that positions itself in pure opposition to power tends to survive in forms too broken to continue doing the things that made it worth preserving. He was not collaborating, he was navigating. There is a genuine difference between those two things, though the line between them is not always as clear as the people on either side of it would prefer to believe. There was a morning in 1068 when a Norman lord arrived at Evesham with a claim to land that the monastery had held for decades. The claim was not strong by any honest reading of the available records, but the lord had soldiers and a letter from a Norman official and the specific confidence of a man who understood that the legal framework for sorting out these disputes was currently being written by people who looked like him rather than like the monks he was talking to. Ethelwig received him in the main hall. He brought out the monastery's records, going back several generations, documenting the land in question with the accumulated precision of an institution that had always understood that written records were a form of protection against exactly this kind of conversation. He was calm. He was specific. He was not hostile, and he was not flexible. He explained. In the Norman French, he had been learning since Hastings, because he understood it was now the language you needed to speak if you wanted to be heard. Exactly what the records showed, and what the monastery's claim was, and why he believed the Lord's claim was in error. The Lord left without the land. He did not leave satisfied. He left, having encountered something he had not fully expected, an institution with records that could be read and a leader who knew how to read them and was not going to pretend otherwise. Ethelwig went back to his desk after the Lord left and wrote a brief note in his personal record. He wrote, "The Norman came for the Westfield. He did not get it. The records held," 3 words, "the records held," the quiet satisfaction of a man who had understood, long before Hastings, that the most durable form of power was not the sword but the document. Now look at what was happening across England at the same time. The English nobility was being replaced, not all at once, not by a single decree, through the accumulation of individual decisions, each one producing the same general direction. A Thing who had fought at Hastings was dead. His land was forfeit. It went to a Norman lord. A Thing who had not fought at Hastings, but had participated in one of the subsequent rebellions, found his land forfeit as well. And the subsequent rebellions were numerous, because the conditions that produced them were never addressed, only suppressed. A Thing who had survived everything, who had neither fought against William nor joined any rebellion, found himself in a legal environment that weighted Norman claims differently than English ones. The courts still functioned. The law still operated. But the people administering the law were increasingly Norman, and the people with political connections to the administrators were increasingly Norman. And the accumulation of these individual cases over years produced an outcome that no single decree had mandated, but that the system generated reliably anyway. By the time Domesday Book was compiled in 1086, the figures were stark. Before the conquest, the English aristocracy had held nearly all the land in England. After 20 years of Norman rule, English landholders retained a small fraction of what they had held before. This did not happen because of violence alone. Though violence was part of it, it happened because the new order created conditions that systematically disadvantaged English landholders and systematically advantaged Norman ones. And because those conditions operated every day, through the normal processes of law and inheritance and political patronage, processes that looked neutral but were not, the castles were the visible symbol of this transformation. The transformation itself was deeper than stone. William returned to England in late 1067 and spent the following years moving between the two territories, managing the cross-channel empire that the conquest had created. The problem of governing two territories simultaneously was not new to him. He had delegated Normandy to Matilda for years. He now delegated parts of England to the officials he had appointed and came back to manage the consequences of their management. The consequences required management. His officials in England were capable men who understood how to maintain control. They were less consistently capable at understanding the difference between maintaining control and maintaining the conditions under which control would still be functioning 20 years later. They were men who had won a war and believed that winning had entitled them to govern as they chose. They were not wrong that winning had entitled them to power. They were sometimes wrong about what using that power well actually required. William imposed corrections. He settled disputes. He demonstrated, through the consistency of his attention, that the conquest was not going to be discredited by the behavior of the men he had brought with him. He needed England productive, not just controlled. A country being systematically looted by its new rulers was a country that would not generate the revenue and the stability that made the conquest worth its cost. He built to make it work. The Tower of London, the castle at Winchester, the cathedral rebuilding program that would transform the ecclesiastical landscape of England across the following generation. Not just because Normans liked building things, though they did, but because building was governance, was the physical expression of permanence. was the answer to the question of whether what had happened at Hastings was occupation or settlement. Occupation ends when the occupiers decide to leave. Settlement cannot end that way, because by the time you want to leave, there is nowhere to go back to. The land, the buildings, the marriages, the institutions, the children born speaking both languages. All of it creates facts that are more durable than any individual intention. William was building settlement. The English were living inside it. Outside Evesham, on the hill above the monastery, a wooden tower had appeared the previous winter, a motte and bailey, put up in a few weeks by a Norman lord who had been granted land in the surrounding area and who understood the local communication. Ethelwig could see it from his window on clear mornings. He had thought about it, off and on. Over the months since it appeared, he thought about what it meant that the hill above the monastery now had a Norman tower on it. He thought about the view from that tower, which would include the monastery, the fields, the river, the roads, everything that Evesham was and had. He was not afraid of it. Fear was not a useful response to a permanent fact, but he was aware of it. Every morning when he could see it clearly, he was aware of it. He worked. The monastery needed managing. The records needed maintaining. The relationships with the surrounding community needed tending. The legal disputes that kept arriving needed careful handling. He did all of it with the focused attention of a man who understood that the tower on the hill was going to be there regardless of what he did, and that the question was not whether to live in its shadow, but how to live in it in a way that preserved what mattered. He did not know how much longer he had. He was getting older. The work was getting harder. The world he had grown up in, the world he had spent his life building and maintaining, was being replaced piece by piece by something different, something he could navigate but never fully belong to. He worked. He kept the records. The records held. Start with what the ground looked like afterward. Simeon of Durham was a monk who spent his life in the northeast of England, writing about the history of his region with the care of someone who understood that what he was recording might be the only version that survived. He wrote about many things, about saints and bishops and the institutional life of the church in the north of England across several generations. He wrote about the winter of 1069 to 1070 differently. The language he used was specific in a way that his other writing was not. He wrote that he had seen, with his own eyes, human bodies lying unburied in houses and in roads, because there were not enough living people in some areas to bury the dead. He wrote that travellers passing through Yorkshire in the years after that winter found no human habitation between York and Durham, a stretch of roughly 100 miles where the villages had been burned and not rebuilt, because the people who would have rebuilt them were gone. He wrote these things in the flat, careful Latin of a man who understood that dramatic language would give future readers an excuse to dismiss what he was saying as exaggeration, and who had decided that accuracy was more important than effect. He was not exaggerating. Now, go back to the beginning of it and understand how it happened. The north of England had never fully accepted the Norman conquest. This was not irrational, and understanding why it was not irrational matters for understanding what came next. The north had its own history, its own political culture, its own deep relationship with Scandinavian traditions that predated the Norman arrival by generations. The great lords of Northumbria had always operated with a degree of independence from southern English power that the geography and the distance made practically necessary. A Norman duke who had won a single battle in Sussex in October 1066 was, from the perspective of the North, a distant authority whose claim to govern Yorkshire and Durham had not been tested against the specific realities of northern English politics. The resistance came in waves. 1067. The first serious uprising in Northumbria. William's appointed earl was killed. William responded with force and restored a version of order. The version was brittle, and everyone could feel it. 1068. More. The underlying conditions had not changed, because addressing them would have required concessions that William was not prepared to make, and that his Norman lords in the north were not prepared to accept. Then, in 1069, everything came together at once. Edgar Atheling, the young man with the legitimate royal blood who had been briefly chosen king after Hastings and had then submitted to William, had not abandoned the question. He had been in Scotland at the court of King Malcolm, gathering what support he could find among the people who had not reconciled themselves to Norman rule. He came south in 1069 and raised the north again. A Danish fleet arrived. King Sweyn of Denmark had his own interest in England, his own sense that the country remained a prize worth contesting. He sent ships into the Humber estuary. The sources estimate the fleet at around 240 ships. The Danes and the English rebels took York together. The Norman garrison was killed. For a moment, the north was lost. William moved north immediately with his army. He paid the Danish fleet to leave, which it eventually did. Removing the external support for the rebellion, he defeated the English rebels in the field, which removed the organized military resistance. And then he made a decision. A woman from a village near Northallerton, whose name is not in any record, because the records that survived from that winter were not the kind that kept the names of farmers' wives, had spent the previous weeks moving her children away from the roads when soldiers passed. Her husband had been careful. He had not gone to York with the rebels. He had kept his head down in the specific way of a man who understood that the large events happening around him were not things he could influence, and that his job was to get his family through them. He was in the yard when the soldiers came through in January. They were burning the village, not because anyone in the village had done anything specific, because this was what the orders said. Burn the grain, kill the livestock, take what could be carried, and destroy what could not. Her husband moved toward the soldiers. The sources do not record why. Maybe he was trying to argue. Maybe he was trying to protect something specific. Maybe he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment in the way that people are sometimes simply in the wrong place. He was killed. She took her children and walked south through the snow. She walked for days. She joined the streams of people moving away from the burning, the specific movement of a population that has been stripped of everything that sustained it in winter, moving toward anything that might not yet have been destroyed. She reached a monastery that was taking in refugees and stopped there. She survived that winter. Her children survived. What happened afterward is not recorded anywhere. This is what the harrying of the North was, in its most specific and most honest form. Not a military campaign, not a battle, a decision by a king to destroy the capacity of a region to support human life in winter, implemented by soldiers moving through villages and farms with torches, carried out across Yorkshire and the surrounding counties over the course of weeks, producing a result that Simeon of Durham walked through and wrote about and could not find adequate language for. William knew what he was ordering. This requires stating directly, because there is a persistent tendency in historical writing about powerful figures to introduce uncertainty about intent when the actions were clearly terrible. Was he aware of the full scale? Did he understand what a northern English winter did to people who had been stripped of food and shelter. He was an experienced military commander who had been campaigning for 20 years. He had managed sieges. He had managed famines as tools of military pressure. He knew what destroying a region's food supply in winter meant for the people who lived there. He gave the order anyway. The goal was permanent. He intended to eliminate the North's capacity for organized resistance by eliminating its capacity to sustain the population that would organize the resistance. The method was the destruction of everything that kept people alive in January in Yorkshire. The outcome was what Simeon of Durham walked through and described. This was policy, deliberate, considered, implemented by a man who understood exactly what it would produce. The harrying worked. The North did not rise again in any coordinated way during William's reign. The destruction of its population and its agricultural infrastructure eliminated its ability to sustain organized resistance as thoroughly as any military campaign could have done. Norman lords moved in. Castles went up. The administrative structures of Norman governance took root in ground that had been cleared by the specific method of making it impossible for anyone to live there. Orderic Vitalis recorded what William said on his deathbed 17 years later, at the Priory of Saint-Gervais near Rouen. In September 1087, he was dying of injuries from a fall from his horse at Mantes. He knew he was dying. He had been given time to make his confession and to say whatever he needed to say before the accounting that his faith told him was coming. He said many things about the harrying. Orderic recorded him saying this. He had fallen on the English of the northern counties like a ravening lion. He had ordered their homes and their children and their possessions to be burned to ashes. He had done this in a criminal manner, killing many thousands by starvation and by sword. He said he was guilty of this crime and would not survive to atone for it. These are not the words of a man who did not know what he had done. These are the words of a man who knew exactly what he had done and who had carried that knowledge for 17 years, and who, in the final accounting that his faith required of him, did not reach for justification or context or the argument that the necessity of the action made it less criminal. He said he had done it criminally. He said he was guilty. He did not say he would not have done it again. That last piece is not in Orderic's account because Orderic did not ask the question and William did not volunteer the answer. But the question is present in the gap between the confession and the career. William did not change his methods after the harrying. He did not govern differently in the years that followed. He confessed the crime at the end of his life and did not use the confession to revise his understanding of what governing required. This is the thing that makes the confession both important and deeply unsatisfying. He knew it was wrong. His own words say so. His moral framework gave him specific language for what he had done, and the language was unambiguous. He was not a man without conscience. He was a man whose conscience told him one thing and whose governance told him another, and who had found a way to keep those two things from forcing a resolution for 17 years by holding them in separate compartments of his mind. The harrying worked. That is also true. The question of what to do with both of those facts, with the confession and the effectiveness, with the crime and the silence of the North in the years that followed, is not a question that resolves cleanly into a verdict. It is a question about what governance requires and who pays the price for what it requires, and whether the people who pay the price were ever part of the calculation that decided it was worth paying. The woman who walked south through the snow with her children was not part of that calculation. She was the price. Outside Evesham, Ethelwig heard about the harrying from traders passing through in the spring of 1070. The North had been quiet through the winter in a way that, once explained, was worse than noise. He sat with the information for a long time. He had been navigating the Norman world for 4 years by then. He had made his accommodations. He had protected his monastery by making it useful. He had kept the records and held the land and maintained the institutional continuity that was the only form of protection available to an Anglo-Saxon abbot in the world after Hastings. He had told himself, and believed, that this was the right course, that an institution preserved could continue to serve. That cooperation was not the same as endorsement, that the monastery's survival meant something for the people it served. He sat in his study in the spring of 1070 and thought about what had happened to the north. He did not write about it in his institutional records. He wrote about land grants and legal disputes and the management of the monastery's estates. He wrote about the practical business of keeping a large religious house functioning in a changed world. But in his personal notes, the ones that were not institutional records, he wrote a single line about the north. He wrote, "God will account for this. I cannot." Then he went back to work. He worked for 7 more years. He managed the monastery with the focused competence he had always brought to it. He navigated the Norman administrative world with the practical intelligence that had kept Evesham intact when many comparable institutions had been absorbed or destroyed. He died in 1077. The monastery he had spent his life building continued after him, though the world it operated in was no longer his world. His successor eventually gave way to a Norman appointee, which was the pattern that played out in institution after institution across England, as the generation that remembered the Anglo-Saxon world gave way to the generation that had grown up inside the Norman one. What Ethelwig had built held. The records he had kept survived. The land the monastery held in 1066 was still the monastery's land when Domesday Book was compiled 9 years after his death. He had done what he set out to do. He had not been able to account for the north. Nobody had. William died in Rouen in 1087. His confession about the harrying was recorded by Orderic Vitalis, who had grown up in the world the conquest had made, and who had decided, as a matter of principle, that recording what powerful men said about what they had done was more important than protecting the reputations of those powerful men. Orderic wrote it down. Simeon of Durham wrote down what he had seen. The woman who walked south through the snow left no record. The ground she walked through left a record of its own kind. The Domesday entries for Yorkshire repeat it with the flat regularity of an administrative document that has no language for what it is describing. Worcester, it is waste. Field after field. Village after village. The 2 Latin words that meant the survey commissioners had arrived and found nothing to count. Worcester est. One of the coldest administrative traces of an atrocity in English history, written in the flat language of record-keeping, repeated across hundreds of entries in a royal survey, carrying more weight in its repetition than any dramatic account could have carried in its feeling. William had confessed it. The book recorded it. The ground remembered it long after everyone who had been there was gone. There is a word that appears in documents from this period with increasing frequency as the 1070s give way to the 1080s. The word is nova. New. Nova arrangement. Nova grants. Nova customs. The administrative language of the Norman period reached constantly for this word. And the reaching was not accidental. Calling something new was itself a political act. If the arrangement was new, it did not need to be measured against what had existed before. It stood on its own terms, justified by its own logic, answerable to its own standards, rather than to the accumulated weight of what Anglo-Saxon England had built over 5 centuries. William was building a new England. He knew it. The people around him knew it. The English people living inside the construction knew it most clearly of all, because they were the material being worked. Start with the land, because in the 11th century, the land was everything. Before Hastings, England's land was held by English people. This sounds obvious, but the specificity matters. The great earls, the thegns, the minor landholders, the church institutions that had accumulated estates over centuries of donations and purchases and royal grants. Virtually all of them were part of an unbroken Anglo-Saxon story. The land and the people who held it were the same story. After Hastings, that story was interrupted. The interruption did not happen all at once. William was careful, in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, to present himself as the legitimate heir of Edward the Confessor rather than a foreign invader. He confirmed some English landholders in their estates. He made promises about respecting existing arrangements. He needed the English administrative machinery to keep functioning, which meant the English people who ran it needed enough security to continue their work. But the promises had conditions, and the conditions had a direction. A landholder who had fought at Hastings lost everything. His land was forfeit as a rebel against the legitimate king, which is what William was. Legally, from the moment Ealdred placed the crown on his head in December 1066, the individual circumstances of each case, whether a particular man had been at Hastings out of genuine loyalty to Harold, or because the local lord had shown up with armed men and he had not had a realistic choice, were not something the Norman courts spent much time investigating. A landholder who had not been at Hastings but participated in any subsequent rebellion also lost his land. The rebellions of 1067 through 1071 produced another wave of forfeitures, another transfer of English-held land to Norman lords who had distinguished themselves in the suppression. A landholder who had survived everything, who had neither fought against William nor joined any rebellion, found himself in a legal environment that was being gradually reshaped in ways that disadvantaged his position regardless of his personal conduct. Norman lords around him operated under different feudal arrangements. The courts still functioned, but the people administering them were increasingly Norman, and the political connections that mattered in legal proceedings ran through Norman networks. The system was not designed to eliminate the English landowning class. It was designed to govern effectively, but it produced elimination anyway, through the accumulation of cases that each followed their own logic and collectively pointed the same way. By 1086, when Domesday Book recorded the landholding situation across England, the figures were unambiguous. The English aristocracy had effectively ceased to exist as a class. The land was held by Normans and by the small number of other French-speaking incomers who had come with William or afterward. Now move from the land to the church. Lanfranc became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, and this was the central act in the transformation of the English church. He was a genuine reformer. He believed the church needed more discipline, more organization, more alignment with the reforming movement, reshaping European Christianity. He held councils. He imposed standards. He brought the English church into closer alignment with continental practice. He was also William's man. His reforms served both God and the crown, and neither Lanfranc nor William saw any contradiction in this, because they shared a framework in which genuine religious reform and effective royal governance were supposed to reinforce each other. The English bishops and abbots who were replaced in the years following were not replaced primarily because they were corrupt or incompetent. Most of them were replaced because the new order required Norman faces in positions of ecclesiastical authority. And the two justifications, theological reform and political control, were so thoroughly intertwined that separating them was not practically possible. Stigand had been removed at a church council in 1070. The other English bishops were replaced more gradually. Ethelwig of Evesham had survived longer than most by being genuinely useful to the new order, and his survival until 1077 was itself a measure of how much value that usefulness could purchase. After his death, a Norman appointee eventually took the position. It was the pattern that played out everywhere. Then there was the language. Norman French became the language of the court, the law, the military command, the upper reaches of the church. Anglo-Saxon became the language of the people who worked the land, who traded in local markets, who conducted the daily business of ordinary life below the level at which official records were made. The two languages did not simply coexist. They occupied different social positions, and everyone knew which position was which. Orderic Vitalis occupied the space between them. He was 10 years old in 1075, when his father, a Norman knight named Odola, sent him to the monastery of Saint Evroult in Normandy to be educated. He was weeping when he left England. His mother was English, and he had grown up in Shropshire, speaking the language she spoke. The monastery was Norman, and the language was Norman, and the world he was being sent into was the world his father's people had made. He learned Norman French. He learned Latin. He spent 60 years in that monastery and became one of the most important historians of his era. He wrote about the conquest from both sides, with the honesty of a man who carried both sides in his own blood and had decided that accuracy was worth more to him than the comfort of a clean story in either direction. He wrote that the English groaned under the Norman yoke. He used that image deliberately. He was a Norman monk writing in a Norman monastery, and he chose the image of a yoke, the tool of compulsion placed on the necks of working animals. This is what honest history looks like from inside a conquered world. One morning in 1072, in a village in Cambridgeshire that had been part of a Thegan's estate before Hastings, a man named Wulfric was working the same field he had worked for 20 years. The field looked the same. The soil felt the same. The work was the same work. The man who owned the field was different. Wulfric held his land, now at the will of a Norman lord named Pico, the newly appointed sheriff of Cambridgeshire, a man whose name appears in multiple documents from this period, and who appears in all of them as someone whose interpretation of his authority was expansive. Wulfric did not hold his land by right. He held it because Pico had not yet found a better use for him than having him farm it. The difference between those two ways of holding land was everything in the world of 1066. And it was also, on a specific morning in October 1072, nothing you could see from the outside. The field looked the same. The sky looked the same. Wulfric's hands in the soil felt the same. But he knew, he had known since the first Norman soldiers had ridden through the village after Hastings. He had known through the forfeitures and the legal disputes and the gradual disappearance of the Thegans, who had been the visible local face of the world. He understood. He carried the knowledge, the way people carry things they cannot put down and cannot change, with the specific weight of a permanent fact that has no remedy available. He worked the field. He would work it again tomorrow. His son would work it after him, but not in the same way. His son would grow up speaking some Norman French, because the people who determined whether you ate spoke Norman French. And his son's children might speak it more fluently than they spoke the language Wulfric was thinking in right now. And at some point after that, The line between the two languages would start to blur in the way that lines blur when two communities live close enough together, long enough that the distinction stops mattering to the people living it, even if it continues to matter to the historians who will later try to describe it. This is how conquests work when they last. They do not replace the conquered world entirely. They transform it, layer by layer, until the transformation is deep enough that the question of what it replaced becomes a matter of scholarship rather than grievance. That transformation takes generations. It takes the specific biological reality of two populations living in close proximity long enough that children are born who carry both, who speak both, who belong to both, in ways that make the original distinction feel increasingly abstract. England, in the 1080s, was not that country yet. The transformation was underway. The pain of it was still present in living memory. The specific losses of land and language and position and the world you had understood yourself to belong to were losses that people were still living inside rather than reading about. But the direction of travel was already clear. The Norman lords who built their castles and endowed their churches and arranged their marriages were not planning to leave. Their children were being born in England. Their grandchildren would be born in England. The French language they brought with them would eventually be absorbed into the English language it displaced, producing a hybrid so complete that you could not pull the two threads apart without destroying the fabric they had made together. The English language survived. This requires a moment of attention because it was not guaranteed, and because the people who made it happen did not know they were making history. They were just speaking the language their parents had spoken. In the fields and the kitchens and the markets, and the conversations that official records did not capture. They were speaking it because it was their language, and no amount of Norman French in the courts and the castles could reach into the daily interior of 1,000,000 lives and change what people said to each other when no one important was listening. Anglo-Saxon contracted socially. It lost its status as the language of power and law and serious writing. It continued as the language of daily life. And over the generations that followed, something happened that nobody planned and nobody could have prevented. The Norman French of the conquerors and the Anglo-Saxon of the conquered began to find each other. The Norman lords needed to communicate with their English tenants. The English tenants needed to understand their Norman lords. Children born to parents from both communities grew up bilingual in the natural way of children, who learn whatever language the world around them is speaking. The language that emerged from this process over the following century was not Norman French and not Anglo-Saxon. It was Middle English, the language that Chaucer would write in, that Shakespeare's language descended from, that eventually became the most widely spoken language in human history. William wanted Norman French to be the permanent language of power in England. He got it for a generation. Then the country he had conquered spoke back to him in its own voice. Slowly, over centuries, and the language of the conquered absorbed the language of the conquerors with the specific patience of something that does not need to win an argument to outlast the people making it. He did not live to see this. He could not have imagined it. But this is what conquest looks like when the conquered people survive. Not the dramatic resistance of battles and rebellions, which can be suppressed, the quiet, daily, unkillable persistence of people continuing to be who they are in the spaces where power cannot fully reach. Wulfric, in his field, speaking to himself in the language his mother had spoken, working the same ground he had always worked, waiting for nothing in particular, and in that waiting, preserving something that no castle and no legal document and no Norman lord on horseback could take from him, because it was not held in any form that could be confiscated. It was just the sound of his own thoughts. That was enough. That turned out to be enough. Christmas, 1085, Gloucester. William held his court there that year, moving through England with the restlessness of a ruler who understood that presence was a form of governance and absence was an invitation to problems. Gloucester was a significant town in the Western Midlands, a place where the king could receive reports from the West and conduct the business of a reign that was, in its 20th year, still requiring the same continuous attention it had required in its first. He called his council together after Christmas and told them what he intended to do. He was going to send commissioners across every county in England. They were going to hold inquiries in every administrative subdivision below the county level. They were going to ask, under oath, a specific set of questions about every piece of land in the country. Who held this land before the conquest? Who holds it now? How many people live on it? How many ploughs does it support? What is it worth? What was it worth before the conquest? The last question was not an accident. By asking what the land had been worth before the conquest, William was building into the survey an explicit acknowledgement that there had been a pre-conquest England, whose arrangements were relevant to the accounting of the current one. He was also, by asking who holds it now, creating a definitive record of the landholding settlement that 20 years of forfeitures and grants and disputed claims and legal proceedings had produced. This was the moment when the transformation of English landholding from its Anglo-Saxon form to its Norman form would be recorded permanently in a document that carried the authority of a royal survey backed by oath. The commissioners went out in 1086. They arrived in the hundreds with their scribes and their questions and the specific authority of men conducting a royal inquest, which, in the Norman legal framework, was a very serious thing. They were not people local lords could easily ignore. They were senior churchmen and Norman barons of sufficient standing that resisting them was a different kind of problem from resisting an ordinary official. The inquiries were public. Jurors were sworn. Questions were asked and answers recorded. The findings from different areas were compared, and inconsistencies were investigated. The English called it the Domesday Survey. Almost immediately, the name came from the comparison to the Last Judgment, the final accounting in Christian theology, when all deeds would be examined and no appeal from the verdict would be possible. The Domesday Book, they said, was like the Book of Judgment. You could not argue with it once it had spoken. If the book said a particular lord held a particular piece of land, that was the record, and no amount of contrary testimony from local witnesses was going to change it. The book that resulted from the survey is still in existence. You can look at it today at the National Archives in Kew. It has been digitized. The original documents, written in compressed Latin on parchment made from sheepskin, are 940 years old and still legible. If your family has English roots and your ancestors were in England in 1086, their land may be in it, not them personally, unless they held land above a certain level. But the ground they worked, the estate they were part of, the assessment of its value in the year, William decided he needed to know exactly what he owned. The survey covered all of England south of the Tees and Ribble rivers. The north that William had harried in 1069 to 1070 was included, and the entries for Yorkshire and the surrounding counties have a quality that is different from the entries for the south. Many of them say two words: Worcester est. It is waste. The Latin phrase appears over and over in the Yorkshire folios. marking the land that had been destroyed 15 years earlier and had not yet been fully resettled. Field after field, village after village, the survey commissioners arrived, asked their questions, and wrote down what they found. Nothing to count. No ploughs, no people, no value. Wasta est, one of the coldest administrative traces of an atrocity in English history, the bureaucratic language of a royal survey, recording in its flat institutional way the outcome of a decision made by the man who had commissioned the survey, the harrying of the North, reduced to 2 Latin words, repeated across hundreds of entries, carrying more weight in its repetition than any dramatic account could have carried in its feeling. Now, think about why William wanted this survey. The official reason, presented to the Gloucester Council, was military and financial. William faced the threat of a Danish invasion in 1085. Knut, the Fourth of Denmark, was assembling a fleet. William needed to know exactly what resources he had and exactly how they were distributed across the country. This is a genuine reason. It is not a sufficient explanation. A survey that took the better part of a year to conduct and produced a document of this scope was not designed primarily to address a single military threat. It was designed to create something permanent, a record that would outlast the immediate crisis and serve the governance of England for generations. By asking who held land before the conquest and who holds it now, William was creating a legal record that froze the settlement of the conquest at a specific moment and made that settlement the permanent baseline. The argument was over. The book had spoken, but there was something else. By knowing exactly what he had, William was making it clear that he knew, a king whose subjects understand that the king has a precise accounting of every piece of land in the country, that this accounting has been made under oath and recorded in a permanent document, governs differently than a king whose knowledge is general and dependent on what his officials choose to tell him. The survey was a signal as much as it was a document. The signal said, I have counted everything. I know what you have. I know what you owe, and I have it in a book that does not forget. There was a man named Peacoat who served as sheriff of Cambridgeshire during this period. He appears in documents from across these years, and he appears in most of them as someone whose understanding of his authority was notably expansive. He held lands in Cambridgeshire that had previously belonged to various English landholders. The Domesday survey recorded these holdings with the same flat precision it applied to everything else. Who held it before? Who holds it now? What it is worth? The survey did not resolve the disputes that Pico had generated. It recorded them, which was a different, and in some ways, more lasting thing. Beside certain entries in the Cambridgeshire folios, the commissioners noted that a holding was disputed, or that the jurors said one thing and the sheriff said another, or that the transfer of ownership had happened in circumstances that were not clearly documented. These disputes were not resolved, but they were written down in the specific, permanent, unchallengeable form of a royal survey backed by oath. They were written down, and what is written down in that form is harder to deny later than what exists only in memory or verbal claim. A sokeman from Suffolk appears in the Domesday record holding a small piece of land under a Norman lord, before the conquest. The entry notes, this land had been held by a free man who could sell it or commend himself to another lord as he chose. Now it was held differently. The person farming it was no longer free in the same way. The record did not explain how this change happened. It noted the before and the after. There are thousands of entries like this in Domesday. The before and the after. The free man, who was now a villain. The Thines land, now in Norman hands. the estate assessed at one value before the conquest and at a lower value now, the gap representing the disruption and the uncertainty and the years of conflict that had reduced what the land could produce. The survey recorded a country that had been through something enormous. It did not editorialize. It did not need to. Everyone who held the book in 1086 knew exactly what the something was. William was at Salisbury in August 1086 when the completed returns came in. He held a ceremony there at which the major landholders of England came to him and swore fealty. A mass oath-taking that was itself a use of the survey. If the survey told you who held land, it told you who was obligated to come to Salisbury and swear. The two things were the same list. He stood at Salisbury and received the oaths of the men whose names the survey had recorded, the men whose obligations to him were now written down as clearly as the land they held. He had been King of England for 20 years. He had fought his way in. He had built his way in. He had burned his way in. Now he had counted his way in. This was the final act of possession. And it was different in kind from everything that had preceded it. The sword had taken England. The castles had held it. The legal and administrative structures had organized it. The church reform had aligned its most powerful institution with his governance. All of these things were real, and all of them were permanent. But the book named it, to name everything, to put every field and every farm and every person of consequence into a document that carried the authority of a royal survey and the finality of a court of last resort, was to possess England in a way that conquest alone could never achieve. You could challenge a castle. You could dispute a legal ruling. You could wait out the man who held the sword and hope his successor was more accommodating. You could not argue with a book that had already decided. William had always understood that the story about the thing mattered as much as the thing itself. He had understood it in Normandy when he built his administration around records and obligations rather than personal loyalty. He had understood it when he used Harold's oath as the foundation for a papal blessing for an invasion. He had understood it when he set up his tent on the ridge at Senlac, where Harold had commanded, claiming the ground where the story had changed. Domesday Book was the final, definitive version of that story. The story about England, recorded in permanent form, carrying the full authority of his 20 years of kingship, saying what England was and who held it and what it was worth. It is still there. You can read it today. You can find the name of the village your ancestors may have lived in, if they were in England in 1086, and read the entry that describes the land and the lord and the number of ploughs and the value of the estate. William reviewed the returns as they came in. He was aging. He was heavier than he had been in the years of the conquest. The specific vigour that had driven him from Falaise to Hastings to the construction of a new English order was still present. But it was present in a body that had been making demands on itself for 6 decades, and that was beginning to show the accumulated cost of those demands. He had one more problem he had not solved. He had a family, and the family, as it turned out, was the thing that all the surveys and all the castles and all the papal blessings and all the administrative sophistication of the most organized ruler in Northern Europe could not reach. The book was done. England was named. His sons were still his sons, with everything that implied. Robert Curthose was 30 years old and had been waiting for his inheritance his entire adult life. Short legs. That was what the name meant. His father's nickname for him, used openly enough that it survived into the historical record, which tells you something about how William managed the relationship between who his son was and what his son was supposed to become. Robert was not stupid. People who observed him without the specific distortion of the father-son dynamic described a man with genuine qualities. He was physically brave in the way that the sources consistently acknowledge, the reckless courage of a man who did not fully believe consequences would apply to him personally. He was generous, freely, and sometimes extravagantly, with the resources of someone who had not had to manage their own finances. He was charming in the specific way that creates loyalty in the people around you, regardless of whether the charisma is matched by the capacity to deliver on what it promises. The people who attached themselves to Robert did so with real enthusiasm. The problem was not his qualities. The problem was the gap between what his father had built and what Robert was equipped to maintain. William had constructed his authority from nothing, under conditions of genuine danger. Through decades of cold sieges and careful administration, and the patient cultivation of every useful relationship he could find, the discipline this required was not philosophical. It was practical, forged in siege camps and conspiracy-prone courts, and the recurring knowledge that hesitation could cost him everything. Robert had grown up in the household of the most powerful man in northern France and England. He had not been tested in the ways that had made William what he was. And the qualities that those tests built were not ones that a comfortable upbringing reliably produced. William knew this. He had watched his son for 30 years. He was not a man who missed things. He was looking directly at. He also could not give Robert Normandy. This is the thing that requires sitting with. Because the reasons William gave were real, but they were not all the reasons. The practical reasons were genuine. Robert made decisions quickly and without sufficient consideration. His generosity with resources created obligations that others then had to honor. He needed more experience with the actual exercise of authority before being trusted with independent governance. But underneath the practical reasons was something that the sources gesture toward without fully naming. Normandy was not simply a territory William held. It was the first and most fundamental proof of everything he had built. He had fought for it as a child, defended it as a teenager, organized and expanded it as a young man, handing it to Robert, even to Robert who was going to inherit it eventually. While William was still alive and still capable, required a separation that the sources suggest he could not make. He kept Normandy. He kept giving Robert reasons why not yet. In 1077, Robert ran out of patience. The immediate trigger, as the sources describe it, was an incident at the castle of L'Aigle, where Robert's younger brothers, William Rufus and Henry, poured water, or something worse, on Robert from an upper floor, in a way Robert read as deliberate humiliation. Robert demanded punishment. William laughed. The laughter was the thing. Whether William actually laughed, or whether the scene has sharpened in the retelling, the dynamic it captures is accurate. William did not take Robert's grievances seriously in the way Robert needed them to be taken. He treated his oldest son's dignity as negotiable, as something less important than the smooth management of the court and its relationships. Robert left the court that day. He gathered supporters among the Norman barons, who had their own reasons to prefer a more generous and less demanding lord than William. He went to his mother's relatives in Flanders and to the French King Philip, who was always interested in opportunities to complicate Norman power. He raised a rebellion. He was in arms against his own father. William responded the way he had responded to every challenge since Valles Dunes. He moved against Robert's positions with direct force. He refused to negotiate in ways that would give Robert what he actually wanted, which was not specific concessions but recognition, the acknowledgement that his grievances were real and that he mattered as something more than the person waiting to inherit. He could not kill Robert. This was the constraint that changed everything about the conflict, and William had no good answer for it. He had spent his reign being willing to use force on problems that required force. He had not hesitated at Falaise Dunes or at the sieges or at the harrying of the north. But Robert was his son and his designated heir. And killing him or permanently imprisoning him would solve the immediate problem at the cost of creating a larger one. The succession would fracture. The Norman barons who supported Robert would have their suspicions about William confirmed. The damage would exceed the benefit. So the conflict ran. Robert would be reconciled with his father, would be brought back to court with something resembling recognition, would find that the recognition evaporated in practice, and would eventually leave, again looking for allies and another opportunity. At Gerberoi in 1079, they met in battle, father and son on opposite sides of a medieval engagement. Robert wounded William in the hand during the fighting. Then he unhorsed him, recognized his father, dismounted, and offered his own horse so that William could continue. In the middle of a battle against his own father, Robert recognized him and chose not to press the advantage. William accepted the horse from the son he was fighting. They were trying to destroy each other, and they were also father and son. And that second fact could not be made to stop being true, no matter how hard the first fact pressed against it. Matilda held the space between them. She had been in contact with Robert during his periods of exile, sending him money, maintaining the relationship that being his mother allowed in ways that being William's wife made politically delicate. She was not betraying William. She was refusing to treat the conflict between her husband and her son as a conflict that required her to choose one side and enforce the choice. William discovered the money and was angry. Matilda told him she could not allow her child to be in want while she had resources to prevent it. The argument was not recorded. What was recorded is that the marriage continued, that William did not formally sanction Matilda for the contact, and that the money kept flowing. She died in November 1083. She died at the Abbey of the Holy Trinity in Caen, the monastery she had built with William, and she was buried there as she had apparently wished. She was somewhere in her early 50s. The sources are not precise about her birth, which is typical for women of the period regardless of their importance. William was there when she died, or arrived very quickly after. The sources note his grief without recording its form. They note that he continued governing because he had no other option, and that the specific quality of his governance in the years after her death was different from the years before it, in ways that observers at the court noticed and recorded without fully being able to name. He was heavier, less patient, more alone in a way that was visible to the people around him without being something any of them had language for. The sons remained a problem, not just Robert. William Rufus, the second son, was designated to inherit England, which created its own complications, because England and Normandy were now practically inseparable, and dividing them would produce governance problems, regardless of how carefully the division was managed. Henry, the youngest, was left money but no land, which was the kind of provision that produced exactly the resentment it sounded like. 3 sons, 3 different settlements in his mind, 3 different levels of grievance about those settlements. A family organized around competition for a father's approval and a father's resources, presided over by a man who had spent his entire life competing for approval and resources, and who had the specific difficulty of men who have earned everything the hard way with people who have not. He held church councils and issued charters and reviewed Domesday returns and managed the diplomatic relationships that kept his cross-channel empire from fracturing at the seams. He did all of this with the competence of 20 years of practice. But Matilda was gone, and without her, the specific counterbalance she had provided to everything he was gone too. And the court felt it, even if no one said so directly. In 1087, the last challenge came from a direction that was almost ordinary in its smallness. The French King Philip had been pressing on the Norman borders in the Vexin, the contested territory between Normandy and France that had been a source of friction for decades. Philip made moves that William could not ignore without appearing weak. William responded in August 1087 with a military campaign against the town of Mantes in the French Vexin. He burned it. This was a military action of the kind William had conducted many times. It was designed to demonstrate that the Norman duke was still capable of responding to encroachments with force. It worked, in the narrow sense that it communicated what it was designed to communicate. As William rode through the burning town, his horse stepped on something in the debris, a smouldering timber, a piece of collapsed stone. The horse stumbled. William was thrown forward against the saddle with enough force to cause internal injuries that the physicians attending him understood immediately were serious. He was 59 or 60 years old. His body had been making extraordinary demands of itself for decades. The fall at Mantes was not, in isolation, the kind of injury that killed a healthy man in his prime. William was not in his prime. He was taken to the priory of St. Gervais near Rouen. He was put to bed. The physicians watched and reported and did what they could. He had time to consider what he was leaving. Robert, who had spent the last decade alternating between rebellion and uneasy reconciliation, was summoned. The formal arrangements were made. Robert would have Normandy. William Rufus would have England. Henry would have the money that had been designated for him. The conversations that happened in that room at St. Gervais between William and his sons are not recorded with the kind of detail that would let you know what was actually said. What is recorded is that the arrangements were made, that Robert was there, and that the formalities of a king putting his affairs in order were conducted with the seriousness that the occasion required. William also confessed. He confessed the harrying of the north in terms that Orderic Vitalis recorded. He confessed other violences of his reign. He released the political prisoners he was holding, including Odo of Bayeux, his half-brother, who had fallen out with him years earlier and been imprisoned. Releasing prisoners was the kind of gesture dying kings made, an acknowledgement that the calculations that had produced the imprisonments were no longer operative. Odo was released. He went directly to Normandy and began positioning himself for the period after William's death. William noted this from his deathbed. The sources record something like a dry observation about the speed of Odo's movement toward the next arrangement. He still understood people. He understood them to the last. He had built an empire and could not make it hold together as a single thing. He had built a family and could not make the family be what the empire required. These were not failures of intelligence or of will. They were the specific failures of a man who had solved every problem that power and patience and the willingness to pay any cost could solve, and who had discovered, in the end, that some problems were not those problems. You cannot inherit 60 years. You can only inherit the throne. And the throne, at this point, had been shaped by and for a specific person in ways that no formal ceremony of appointment could fully reshape. On September 9, 1087, the bells of Rouen began to ring for morning prayer. William died. The men who had been attending him made their calculations in the way that men in his world made calculations, quickly and without sentimentality about the person who was no longer there to protect them. They took what was portable, the furniture, the equipment, the personal possessions that had accumulated around a king's sick bed over weeks of illness. They left. William lay on the floor of the room they had emptied. He lay there for hours before the people with the authority and the obligation to handle the death of a king organized themselves and returned. Robert was not at Saint-Gervais. He had left before the end, moving toward Normandy, toward the duchy that was now his. He was doing what the practical situation required. William Rufus was in England, moving to secure the treasury at Winchester and to be crowned before anyone could complicate the transition. Henry was in Normandy, counting the money his father had left him. The sons did what sons do when a powerful father dies. They moved toward what they had been promised. The room was empty. Paris was celebrating a man who had spent 60 years building his way out of the definition placed on him at birth, who had crossed a sea and broken a kingdom and rebuilt it in his own image, who had counted every field in England and written it in a book that still exists, who had built towers of stone still standing and legal structures still shaping the country 900 years later, lay on the floor of a room in Rouen while his servants walked away with his things. The world he had made continued without him. It had always been going to. That was both the point and the problem. He had owned England completely. He had never been able to make it not need owning. Sometime in the late 1070s, in a workshop in southern England, a group of women sat down with needles and thread and began to stitch. The material was linen. The thread was wool, dyed in 8 colors that have survived 950 years, with enough vibrancy that you can still read the images clearly today. The surface they were working on would eventually run 70 meters long, a continuous narrative from one end to the other, telling a single story from beginning to end. The story was William's. The Bayeux Tapestry, which is technically an embroidery rather than a tapestry, depicts the events from Edward the Confessor's reign through the Norman conquest and ends with the English in flight after Hastings. It shows Harold in Normandy, the oath, the coronation, the ships being built, the crossing, the battle, the death. It is the most detailed visual record of 11th century warfare and political life that exists. Scholars have been studying it for centuries and are still finding things in it. It was almost certainly commissioned by Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother and the Bishop of Bayeux, as a piece for his cathedral. Odo appears in the tapestry multiple times, always in positions of importance, always associated with the moments that reflected best on the Norman enterprise. People who commission art have always done this, and Odo was not subtle about it. The question of who made it is different from the question of who paid for it. The needlework technique, the specific stitching patterns, the artistic conventions used throughout point to an English workshop. The women who produced this object, and they were almost certainly women, since embroidery of this kind was understood in the 11th century as skilled women's work, were Anglo-Saxon craftswomen working in the tradition of English textile art that had been one of the most admired in Europe before the conquest. English hands made the tapestry that tells the story of England's defeat. Sit with that for a moment. The people who were conquered were hired to record the conquest. The people whose world had been ended were given the needles and the thread and told to stitch the story of its ending in the most durable form available. And they did. They stitched it with extraordinary skill. The horses have a vitality that makes them seem about to move. The faces of the figures carry expressions that communicate emotion across 9 centuries of distance. The battle scenes have a quality of motion. Bodies falling, weapons descending, that suggests the embroiderers were working from detailed descriptions given by people who had been there. But look at the borders. The main narrative runs through the center of the tapestry, the official story. the story Odo commissioned. Above and below this central strip run borders, decorative bands that frame the main images with figures and scenes. Some border scenes are conventional, animals, real and imagined, fables rendered in small figures, the standard decorative vocabulary of the period. Some are not. In the lower border, below the battle scenes, there are stripped bodies, men being relieved of their armor and weapons by figures working systematically through the dead. The stripping of the dead was a practical reality of medieval battle, the recycling of expensive equipment that no one left on a field if they could help it. The border shows it without flinching. These are particular bodies in a particular condition. The people stripping them are doing a job. The border shows the job being done. There are other border scenes that scholars have been arguing about for 200 years. Scenes that seem to comment on the main narrative from below, like a note written in the margin of an official document, whether these were the embroiderers inserting their own perspective, or part of the original design, or simply the result of modern interpreters projecting meaning onto decorative convention, is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that the people who made this object spent months of their lives with it, stitching the story that had reorganized their world, and that what they produced is more complex than a simple celebration of Norman victory. It is a document of the conquest made by the conquered. Orderic Vitalis finished his Historia Ecclesiastica sometime in the 1130s, 50 years after William's death. He had been working on it for decades, building the most comprehensive account of the Norman period that any single author produced. It ran to multiple volumes. It covered the conquest and its aftermath and the reigns that followed. He wrote the last lines as an old man in the monastery of St. Evroult in Normandy, the monastery his father had sent him to at age 10, weeping, speaking little Norman French, being separated from his mother's England at an age when children do not choose their circumstances. He had spent 60 years in that monastery. He had learned its language and its customs and become, in every formal sense, Norman. He had never stopped being also English. Near the end of the Historia, he wrote something that historians have been quoting ever since, because it carries, in its plainness, more weight than most elaborate assessments of the same material. He wrote that he had tried to tell the truth about what he had seen and heard, that he had not concealed things that needed to be said, even when they were unwelcome to powerful people. He was a Norman monk, writing in a Norman monastery, the son of a man who had come to England with the conquest, and he chose accuracy over comfort. He wrote it down. Now, something is happening that would have been impossible to predict when William died on that floor in Rouen. In September of 2026, for the first time in almost 1,000 years, the Bayeux Tapestry is coming to England. The loan agreement between the Bayeux Museum and the British Museum was years in the making, involving the French and British governments and the specific complexities of moving a 900-year-old linen object across the Channel without damaging it. The exhibition is expected to run from September 2026 through the summer of 2027. Hundreds of thousands of people will stand in front of it. They will see William on horseback and Harold with the arrow and the ships crossing the Channel and the horses at Hastings. They will see the official story, the story Odo commissioned from English hands, the story that has been in France for nearly 1,000 years. If they look at the borders, they will see the other story, the stripped bodies, the figures working in the margins, the Anglo-Saxon hands visible in every stitch, present in the object. Even when absent from the story the object tells, the tapestry is coming to England rather than staying in Normandy, not to Caen, where William built his abbey and where what remains of his tomb sits in a church that was largely destroyed in the religious wars of the 16th century. Not to Rouen, where he died. To England, because that is where the story happened. Because England is where everything William spent the first 40 years of his life building toward was either confirmed or destroyed in a single October afternoon on a ridge in Sussex. Because the physical legacy of the conquest, the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, Domesday Book, the legal structures, the place names, the castle earthworks in the fields, all of it is in England. In the country that never chose him, William built a version of himself that could not be removed. Then he spent the rest of his life unable to remove the version of himself that had been placed on him in Falaise before he was old enough to understand what it meant. The bastard who became a conqueror never stopped being, underneath everything he built on top of it. The child who had been told he was not supposed to matter. The castles were his answer to that. Domesday Book was his answer to that. Westminster and the Tower, and the reorganization of an entire country's aristocracy. All of it was his answer to that. And on September 9, 1087, the answer lay on the floor of a room in Rouen, while Paris celebrated and his sons moved toward what they had been promised. The tapestry is still whole, the 70 meters of linen and wool, stitched by English hands in an English workshop in the service of a Norman bishop's self-presentation, has survived 950 years. It survived a period when it was used to cover a wagon during civic celebrations. It survived Napoleon, who considered displaying it in Paris as propaganda before his planned invasion of England that never happened. It survived the Second World War in an underground shelter while bombs fell above it. It is going to England in 2026. The people who stand in front of it are going to see William. They are going to see Harold. They are going to see the ships and the horses and the arrow, and if they look carefully, they will see the Anglo-Saxon hands in every stitch, the hands of the people who lost, still there, still visible, still part of the story, whether the story acknowledges them or not. Go back to the room in Rouen, September 9, 1087, the bells ringing for morning prayer, the body on the floor, the servants already gone, a man who had slept in farmhouses as a child to stay alive, who had waited 3 years outside a castle to prove a point, who had crossed the English Channel on a ship his wife had built for him, who had stood in a half-empty abbey shaking while a city burned outside and received the crown he had spent his life moving toward, who had burned 100 miles of northern England to stop it from rising against him, confessed it as a crime 17 years later, and governed the same way until the day he died, who had counted every field in England and written it in a book that is still in an archive in London, who built things that are still standing, who died alone. The tapestry that tells his story was made by the people he had conquered. The book that records his crimes was written by a man who was the son of his invasion. The language you are hearing right now is the language his language failed to replace. England kept speaking. 960 years later, the tapestry is coming home, to the country that never chose him, to the country he could not stop needing to own, to the country whose language swallowed his. Slowly, over centuries, the way rivers shape stone. Without asking permission, without needing to, he died alone on a floor. The tapestry is still whole. The book is still in the archive. The tower is still standing. The English language is still speaking. Some things outlast the men who tried to end them. Some things outlast everything.